Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today, to discuss the world's crime news, and I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching it? Now make yourself comfortable and relax. Story 1. The New Year's Eve Heist, Tokyo, Japan. On December 31st, as fireworks lit the sky over Tokyo, the city pulsed with celebration. Crowds gathered near the famous Shibuya crossing, counting down to the new year. While the world watched the dazzling lights and listened to the roaring cheers, a silent operation unfolded beneath the chaos. At exactly 11:58 p.m., a team of masked individuals, dressed as janitorial staff, entered the underground vault of a private cryptocurrency firm located in the heart of Shinjuku. They had spent months infiltrating the company. One posed as a cleaning contractor, another as a maintenance engineer. Every move was pre-planned, every detail memorized. Security systems were disabled using an inside code leaked by a disgruntled former employee. In under 10 minutes, the group bypassed biometric locks, disarmed the vault's laser grid, and accessed a cold storage device holding over $80 million in digital assets. By the time the clock struck midnight, the vault was empty. Fireworks masked the helicopter's descent onto a nearby rooftop. The crew vanished into the night sky as the world sang in joy, oblivious to the fact that one of the most sophisticated heists in Japanese history had just occurred. Authorities only discovered the breach at 2:14 a.m., when the morning shift arrived to find the vault wide open and a single item left behind. A New Year's greeting card that read, "Here's to a prosperous new beginning." Today's case takes us to Anaheim, California, a city best known for its attractions. But in 2016, it became the setting for a case that defied belief. What started as a chilling story of harassment and threats soon unraveled into something far more sinister. A woman was accused of relentless stalking, her alleged victim gripped by fear. The evidence painted a damning picture, but beneath the surface lay a truth more shocking than anyone imagined. This is the case of Michelle Hadley, a story of deception, betrayal, and a reality far stranger than fiction. As 2015 slowly drew to a close, 30-year-old Angela was full of hope for the near future. She had just arranged a date, and this new acquaintance seemed promising. She had met 38-year-old Ian Diaz on a dating site. From the very beginning, there was an undeniable spark between them. They quickly found common ground and hit it off. The new year started on a high note for them as they met for the first time on the 2nd of January, 2016. From the moment they saw each other, they felt a special connection. It didn't take long before they fell madly in love. Soon they moved in together, got engaged, and eventually married. Not long after Angela discovered she was pregnant with twins. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. At the time, Ian worked in a specialized police unit as a federal marshal while Angela was employed at a law firm. They were satisfied with their lives. Then on the evening of the 24th of June, 2016, Angela's world was shaken. As she did every day, the 30-year-old drove home. Upon arriving, she pulled into the garage, parked, and got out of her car. That was when she noticed a man, a complete stranger, who suddenly lunged at her. Angela fell to the ground and started screaming, calling for help. She immediately phoned the police, terrified by what had just happened. Fortunately, she wasn't seriously injured. She ended up with nothing more than a torn blouse, a few bruises and scratches. It seemed she had been incredibly lucky. Given that she was pregnant, the stress of the attack was even greater. Angela wasted no time in informing the police who she suspected might be responsible. She hadn't recognized her attacker, but for some time someone had been tormenting her with disturbing messages and posting bizarre online advertisements impersonating her. It had all started several weeks earlier, on the 29th of May. Angela had received an email that read, "I hope you are terrified of tomorrow. I am his princess. You are nothing. Watch your back." From then on, the messages came regularly. Many contained religious references, but they all had one thing in common. The sender claimed to be watching Angela. On June 2nd, she received another chilling email. "I know you just left work. I saw you. Let's have some fun." Many of these messages came with disturbing attachments. Graphic images of dismembered bodies, female victims of violent crimes, and even of F***K***B fetuses. The harassment didn't stop there. Angela also received a LinkedIn message from someone using the name Jason R. The message, written in capital letters, stated, "Michelle is his true and only love. You mean nothing to him. Two names immediately stood out, Michelle and the sender's surname Hadley. Angela's husband, Ian, recognized them straight away. Michelle Hadley was in fact his ex-girlfriend. Suddenly, everything seemed to fall into place. Ian and Michelle's relationship had been particularly tumultuous, full of arguments and conflicts, and their breakup was far from amicable. However, they were still tied together, not just by their strained history, but also by the property they had purchased together. They had taken out a mortgage as a couple, and after their split, they had to somehow come to an agreement about what to do next. That, however, was easier said than done. It was during this time that Michelle began sending Ian a series of unsettling emails. Here are a few excerpts, ones that bear a striking resemblance to some of the other messages mentioned earlier. Michelle wrote, "Your sins are many. I will summon all the forces of God's law and word against you, so that you may be judged." Ian responded, confused as to what God and the Bible had to do with their property and mortgage dispute. But Michelle continued, "Your end is near." Concerned by the increasingly disturbing nature of these messages, Ian forwarded the emails to both the local police and his colleagues at the sheriff's office. Soon after, he also applied for a restraining order against Michelle, citing her emotional instability, past outbursts of anger, and alcohol abuse. He was genuinely fearful for his safety. However, his request was ultimately denied, so when Ian and Angela started suspecting that Michelle was behind the threatening emails, they immediately reported it to the police. This time was Angela who filed for a restraining order, explaining that despite never responding, blocking suspicious email addresses, and refusing to engage, the messages kept coming. Her harasser must have been creating new accounts, just to continue tormenting her. As a result, on June 1st, 2016, Michelle Hadley was notified via email that a restraining order had been issued against her in relation to Angela Diaz. A few days later, officers personally delivered the official order to Michelle at her home. For a brief moment, Angela and Ian felt a sense of relief, but it didn't last long. Just a week later, a man knocked on their door, claiming he had arrived to meet Angela and was ready to fulfill all of her fantasies. Angela and Ian had no idea who he was or what he was talking about. The man explained that Angela had allegedly responded to an advert on Craigslist. The couple, still bewildered, continued questioning him, and that's when he revealed the shocking details. According to the stranger, the advertisement had been seeking men interested in acting out a forced sexual encounter fantasy. Although the encounter was meant to be consensual, the act itself was to be staged as if it were non-consensual. Ian and Angela were stunned. They explained that there must have been a mistake, and the man left their home. Later that same evening in the garage, Angela was not as fortunate. This time another man did not stop to ask questions. Instead, he immediately acted on the instructions he had been given. It soon became clear what had happened. Another advert had appeared online, supposedly posted by Angela, or rather by someone impersonating her. This fake listing included her home address and photo, inviting men to come over and fulfill their desires. The message instructed respondents to ignore Angela's protests, even stating that she would likely pretend not to want it, but that in reality she did. Aside from the first man, who had only knocked on the door and explained why he was there, several others also came forward. Ian was deeply disturbed by the entire situation. He was also frustrated by what he saw as a lack of police action. Frustrated, he declared that his ex-partner Michelle should have been handcuffed and locked away in a room without a doorknob long ago. Nevertheless, the officers took immediate action. After the garage incident, they went to Michelle's apartment and arrested her. The woman was also required to hand over her phone, laptop, and iPad for analysis. Her family paid the required bail amount, and once she was released, the threatening messages started arriving again. Let's rewind a bit. At first, Michelle was informed about the restraining order against her. She seemed genuinely confused and claimed she had never spoken a word to Angela in her life. She insisted that she hadn't sent her any threatening messages and most certainly hadn't threatened her. She explained to detectives that she feared someone was impersonating her and trying to frame her. She had received several suspicious messages, yet the authorities did not believe a word of her explanation. Even after Michelle was released on bail, an unknown man showed up at Angela's apartment once again. This time Angela spotted him in time and wanted to prevent the situation from repeating. The haunting memories of the garage attack were still fresh in her mind. Police arrived at the scene, and it turned out that the 17-year-old boy had come to force himself on Angela after seeing an online ad. Of course, he had no idea that it wasn't Angela who posted the ad. Fortunately, they were able to intervene before any interaction occurred. After this intervention, on July 14th, Michelle Hadley was arrested again and taken into custody. This time, the court set her bail at $1 million, as they deemed her a societal threat. The charges also related to the safety of Angela, who was pregnant. Michelle's family was desperate to help her and believed she was innocent, but they had limited resources. They told her she could either post bail again or hire a good lawyer. Michelle chose to remain in custody because of the charges, which involved attempted assault. She was placed in a high-security unit under special supervision. Though she hadn't attacked Angela herself, authorities were convinced she was responsible for the events and potential dangers that had unfolded. The media quickly became interested in the case, portraying Michelle as a jealous, almost deranged ex-partner who sought revenge on her ex's new girlfriend. The term love triangle was often used in connection with her case. Michelle could hardly believe what had happened. Her life had changed in an instant. Just a short time ago, she had been happily returning from a date when she saw police officers in front of her parents' house. Soon after, those same officers took her phone and computer and then handcuffed her while she was still wearing the short dress she had put on for the date. Michelle was convinced that this nightmare would soon end, that the investigators would explain the misunderstanding and release her. But that wasn't the case. Quite the opposite, in fact. It seemed as if long weeks awaited her. She was treated very differently by the prison staff and fellow inmates. They called her an informant and a snitch, and she was always assigned the most unpleasant tasks like cleaning the toilets. Michelle came from a traditional and fairly conservative family. She grew up in Ontario, California, where her parents ran a business. She was a quiet, introverted person, had little interest in parties or being in the spotlight. Instead, she devoted herself entirely to medieval studies, focusing on the history of the Middle Ages. At 22, Michelle married her then partner, whom she had met in high school. Unfortunately, this marriage didn't withstand the test of time, and it ended before Michelle turned 26. At that point, she met Ian Diaz, who was 6 years older than her. Her life soon revolved mainly around her work. In the autumn of 2011, the two exchanged a few messages on a dating website before meeting at a cafe. Both of them hit it off immediately, and Ian's friends would later describe her as a beautiful and intelligent partner. Ian said that Michelle was the best thing to ever happen to him. By the end of 2014, during a romantic trip to New York, proposed. They set their wedding date for February 2016. After the engagement, the couple bought a dog and began searching for a new apartment. They eventually settled on an apartment in a newly developed complex in the southern part of Anaheim. The apartment cost just under $469,000. Michelle made a down payment of $14,000 and agreed to gradually pay back part of that amount, while they both took out a loan for the remaining balance. On the surface, their life appeared almost fairy tale perfect, but behind closed doors, their relationship was far from ideal. Ian wanted to control Michelle at every step. When they first met, Michelle worked in the marketing department of a large insurance company. Not long after, Ian began persuading her that her job was too stressful. He offered to get her a project manager position at their favorite theme park, Disneyland. He assured her that her health and happiness were his top priorities, and that she would feel comfortable working there thanks to his connections in the park. Urged her to change jobs, even though he knew it would be a lower-paying one. She believed that Ian cared about having his friends monitor every move she made. Soon Ian began exerting pressure on Michelle in other ways. He wanted her to dress more provocatively, wear tighter clothes, get a belly button piercing, and extend her nails. He also bought her a new phone, laptop, and tablet, probably to spy on her. When she went out or left work, he would immediately call her to ask where she was going. He frequently woke her in the middle of the night, insisting that they talk or watch a movie together. Of course, Michelle didn't feel like it. He also told her how much alcohol she could drink and couldn't stand any resistance. When Michelle decided to pursue an MBA, Ian insisted on attending all of her classes with her. When she explained that this wasn't possible, Ian did everything he could to stop her from leaving the house on time. He would create wild arguments. Ian also pressured Michelle to be with another man in his presence, but she refused. She made it clear that she didn't want to go along with his demands. She repeatedly told him that if he didn't stop this behavior, she would end the relationship. Ian, however, dismissed her concerns, claiming that she was overreacting. He often sent her pictures of his genitals, or links to adult videos while she was at work. On Valentine's Day in 2014, was sick and taking medication. Ian began asking her again to fulfill his desire. Michelle was so fed up with his persistent requests that she agreed. Ian immediately posted an ad on Craigslist. Soon an unknown man appeared at their home. Ian had made Michelle 3 drinks despite her taking medication and set up a camera to record everything. He then hid in the bathroom and watched it all unfold. The next day Michelle felt horrible. She told Ian that she felt coerced and exploited. She demanded that the video be deleted. Ian became very upset, claiming that no one had forced Michelle to do what she did. The relationship continued to deteriorate. Once, after an argument, Ian stopped the car in the middle of a busy road and demanded that she get out for not showing him enough respect. The couple even tried therapy, but it ended after one session because Michelle tried to bring up the topic of that Valentine's night when Ian forced her to sleep with another man. Ian became so enraged that he drove around the city like a maniac for several hours, refusing to let Michelle out of the car and threatening to kill them both. Michelle was terrified. The fear was heightened by the fact that Ian owned several firearms and frequently mentioned them. In August 2015, Michelle had had enough. She packed what she could and fled. Ian destroyed everything she left behind. He then maliciously canceled her car insurance. Additionally, he threatened that his friends would visit her at home, work or school. Michelle was so scared that she quit her job. Shortly after, she was diagnosed with PTSD. Despite everything, Michelle tried to rebuild her life. She found a new job and continued to study. Ian was banned from entering the campus. Unfortunately, Michelle had to come to an agreement with Ian regarding the apartment as they still shared the mortgage. It wasn't easy. Michelle began to cope with her sadness through alcohol. During that time, she started sending him strange messages invoking divine rights and reminding him of his sins. She wasn't coping well at all. She was also afraid Ian might try to take revenge on her. She'd had enough. She gave up on her studies, quit another job, and moved back in with her parents. She wanted to get as far away from her ex as possible. Finally, on November 25, 2015, Michelle managed to reach an agreement with Ian about the apartment. The court ordered that he pay Michelle $3,000 and settle the full transfer of the mortgage by June 5, 2016. In exchange, Michelle was to give up her rights to the apartment and Ian could stay in it. If he failed to meet the conditions by the specified date, the apartment would be sold and the money would be split evenly. The police officers investigating the harassment had no knowledge of this arrangement and in fact made no effort to find out. More than 2.5 months passed, and Michelle was still in custody while little progress was made in the case. The only people who analyzed the threatening emails allegedly sent by Michelle were her parents, and they discovered several inconsistencies. For example, when some of these messages were sent, their daughter was either in class or at the hospital. The real breakthrough came when Ian Diaz himself went to the police station. He stated that he suspected his ex-partner was innocent and that it was his wife, Angela, who was framing her. He testified that he had recently discovered that one of the messages from the supposed stalker had been sent from an account he had created himself. Since he didn't send the email, he claimed that his wife must have done it. Ian also said that his wife had lied to him about another important matter. Angela was never pregnant. The ultrasound pictures of twins had been bought on Etsy, where you could easily customize any information. Angela had also lied about many other things. For example, she had told everyone that she had completed law school and was a lawyer, which wasn't true. Her ex-partner Jason, who also served in the police, had met Angela in a bar. They began dating, and after some time Angela told him that she had just learned she had cervical cancer. Jason decided to help her. He offered for her to move in with him, wanting her to feel comfortable, especially since she was about to start chemotherapy. Jason lived with his son, who needed special care. Angela moving in was a big change for Jason's life. Jason believed that Angela was bravely fighting her illness. She even shaved her head bald and sent him photos from her hospital visits. Despite her supposed illness, she remained optimistic and full of energy. Over time, her behavior started to raise suspicions, first among their friends. Angela drank wine, showed no signs of loss of appetite or fatigue. Eventually, she also began suggesting that Jason was not the wonderful partner everyone thought he was. She claimed he was aggressive and toxic. Soon Jason himself became suspicious. He asked a friend to observe Angela on a day she was supposed to have a doctor's appointment. She never even left the house. Later, Jason Googled one of the photos she had sent him and discovered that she had downloaded it from the internet. A confrontation followed. Angela insisted she was sick, but when asked to show a port catheter, something characteristic of oncology patients, she refused. Everything became clear. Angela had never had cancer. The couple broke up. In an instant, the police had a flood of new information. They painted Angela in a very bad light. Based on a search warrant, authorities seized her phone and computer. What they found there led to Michelle's release from jail. On January 6, 2017, Angela Diaz was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, perjury, forgery, theft, and filing a false police report. As the prosecutor explained, these charges were based on the fact that Angela's actions had led to the arrest and imprisonment of an innocent person. The analysis of Angela's mobile devices revealed that she had sent a large portion of the threatening emails to herself. She frequently used a virtual private network, VPN, to cover her tracks. Investigators also found 2 text documents on her computer. One was titled The Inner Darkness, The Story of Angela Diaz, and The Other Daughters of God, Story of Angela Diaz. It seemed that Angela had planned to write down her story, focusing particularly on how she had framed Michelle. She intended to sell it as a script to a television network. Unfortunately, law enforcement had acted too late in this case. It was only when doubts arose that investigators began verifying whether the statements of key witnesses Angela and Ian, alleged victims, were truthful. That's when they discovered that the attack in the garage had never actually happened. Surveillance cameras installed at the Diaz's home showed that no one had entered the property that day. Angela had been home alone. She had likely scratched herself. There had been no attacker. Previously, the police hadn't even checked the surveillance footage. And while Angela initially denied any wrongdoing and appeared relaxed and smiling, she ultimately took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty and in exchange was sentenced to only 5 years in prison, an oddly lenient punishment considering that Michelle had been facing a potential life sentence for false accusations. Angela showed no remorse. Today she is already free. She divorced Ian. It wasn't until Angela's conviction that Michelle was fully cleared of all charges. The prosecutor's office was in no hurry to make this announcement. Michelle had to give them an ultimatum. Either they publicly reveal the truth about what had happened, or she would expose their incompetence herself. A press conference was held during which the prosecutor portrayed Michelle as the victim of a meticulously planned conspiracy. He did not fail to mention that it was the diligent work of investigators that had led to the case being solved. Michelle had tried to cooperate with the police from the very beginning. She had informed them that someone was impersonating her and had handed over all her devices for examination. Had investigators conducted the investigation properly, they would have seen that Michelle had never sent any of the threatening emails. After being taken into custody, she couldn't have sent anything either because her devices were in police possession. To log into her email from another device, she would have needed to pass 2-step verification. When the ordeal began, suspected Ian was behind it. He had connections within law enforcement, which is why she even sought help from the FBI and the Department of Justice. She received no response. Local police ignored her as well. They brushed her off when she called nearly every day, pleading with them to check the IP address of the emails. She emphasized that determining their origin was the key to clearing her name. She also immediately reported the Craigslist post as fraudulent and requested its removal. But even after Angela's conviction, Michelle remained convinced that Ian had masterminded the scheme. The email supposedly sent by her bore the same tone and religious references as the messages she had actually sent Ian after their breakup. How could Angela have known about them? Another strange coincidence was that Michelle's arrest happened just as Ian was facing a court-imposed deadline regarding their shared property. On June 3rd, an Ian's application to transfer the mortgage entirely into his name was denied. He simply couldn't afford it. He was unable to meet the court's conditions. Investigators began to take notice. Ian claimed he had no idea about his wife's actions. He even asked his police colleagues not to reveal his identity, which is why during the press conference he was referred to as John Doe. He gave anonymous interviews saying he was devastated by what his wife had done. But when police finally traced the IP addresses, they discovered that the majority of the threatening emails had been sent from the Diaz's home. Ian had also used his work phone and computer, as well as his personal devices, to send them. He was responsible for posting most of the Craigslist ads. Throughout the investigation, he used his professional position to his advantage. He frequently showed up at the police station in his sheriff's uniform asking about case progress. It became clear that both he and his wife had wanted to frame Michelle, likely to avoid losing the property. At some point, however, Ian realized his plan wouldn't work, so he started covering his tracks. He changed his phone number, deleted all his email accounts, and then went to the police to blame his wife. Ian Diaz was charged with cyberstalking, conspiracy to commit a crime, perjury, and obstruction of justice. In 2023, he was sentenced to 10 years and 1 month in prison. In 2018, Michelle filed a federal civil lawsuit against Ian Diaz, Angela Diaz, the city of Anaheim, and its police force, alleging false imprisonment in violation of her civil rights. This lawsuit was settled in April 2021, though the terms remained confidential. Spent 88 days in jail. Over time, she was able to return to school and complete her MBA. She found a job in the marketing department of a well-known cosmetics brand and even started her own business. She no longer lives in California. She moved to New York to be closer to her sister. She had recently welcomed her first child, a baby girl, and believed they were being invited to engage in a consensual encounter with Diaz. I have a lot of friends and a lot of family who know me very well, and when they saw this in the media, they already knew I didn't do it, and they believed it even before the truth came out. Story 1. In 1971, Argentina was a country struggling with political instability and social unrest. The nation was under a period of military rule, and tensions between the government and various opposition groups were at an all-time high. This climate of unrest would ultimately lead to a criminal event that shocked the nation and attracted international attention. The criminal case that unfolded in Argentina during this period involved a group of individuals with significant political connections and motives. The key figure in this particular case was Carlos Perez, a member of a revolutionary guerrilla group that had gained prominence in the country at the time. Perez, along with several others, was deeply involved in activities that opposed the military dictatorship. They were determined to overthrow the authoritarian regime that controlled Argentina at the time. Carlos Perez was a man in his early 30s, a former student activist who had become disillusioned with peaceful political activism. As he witnessed the violent repression of political dissidents and the growing gap between the elite and the working class people of Argentina, he became more radicalized. His transition into armed resistance was fueled by his belief that the only way to bring about change was through direct confrontation with the military junta. The guerrilla group to which Perez belonged was known as the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, ERP, a Marxist-Leninist organization that sought to establish a socialist government in Argentina. This group was involved in numerous acts of resistance and rebellion against the government. The ERP carried out attacks on military and police installations, bombings, and even kidnappings. Carlos Perez, however, was not the only individual involved in the criminal act that would soon capture the attention of the nation. The people involved were part of a larger underground movement that operated covertly, and their actions often aimed to challenge the status quo of the oppressive government. At the heart of the case was an event that took place on the night of March 19, 1971, when Carlos Perez and his comrades executed a daring and audacious plan. They had been carefully planning the operation for several weeks, and it was meant to send a clear message to the government. It was an act that would not only result in a criminal investigation, but would also change the political landscape of Argentina. The plan was to kidnap a high-ranking military official. The objective was not just to hold him hostage, but to force the government to negotiate the release of political prisoners. The ERP believed that by taking a senior figure from the government, they could leverage this to gain concessions for their cause. The operation was supposed to be swift, precise, and above all, a statement of resistance to the regime. On that fateful night, Perez and his group set their sights on their target, General Julio Rodriguez, a top-ranking official in the Argentine army, known for his brutal tactics in suppressing political dissent. General Rodriguez was at his residence in Buenos Aires when the guerrilla group, heavily armed and prepared for confrontation, surrounded the house. Their mission was clear, but the outcome would not be as straightforward as they had anticipated. What followed was a chaotic series of events involving gunfire, the intervention of the police, and a standoff that would leave both sides shaken. It was a confrontation that would lead to a trail of destruction, deaths, and a nationwide manhunt for the perpetrators. As the story of the attack spread, it became clear that the authorities were determined to capture the members of the ERP. and Carlos Perez's name would soon be at the center of the investigation. This event marked a turning point in the relationship between Argentina's government and its opposition groups. It also highlighted the growing power and determination of guerrilla movements in Latin America, which would continue to be a force to reckon with in the years that followed. The actions of Perez and his group would set the stage for even more violence, as the Argentine military began to crack down on suspected dissidents and members of revolutionary movements. By the time the authorities managed to corner and arrest several of the participants in the plot, Carlos Perez was already on the run. His name became synonymous with defiance against the regime, and he would remain a symbol of resistance for many who opposed the government. However, his actions were also a catalyst for an escalation of government repression, which would culminate in even more severe violations of human rights throughout the 1970s. After the kidnapping attempt on General Julio Rodriguez, which was meant to be a carefully planned strike against the government, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. What was supposed to be a swift and strategic operation to capture the general and leverage his release for political prisoners instead resulted in an intense and violent confrontation that left both sides shaken and with lasting consequences. On the night of March 19, 1971, Carlos Perez and his group, fully aware of the stakes, surrounded General Rodriguez's house in the wealthy district of Buenos Aires. The plan was to quickly overpower the security detail and secure the general without causing any harm, then retreat to a safe house where negotiations could begin. However, as with many such operations, things didn't go as expected. When Perez and his team arrived at the residence, they encountered far more resistance than anticipated. Rodriguez guards, who were on high alert due to the tense political climate, immediately opened fire. What was intended to be a quick raid turned into a gunfight, with shots fired from both sides. The guerrilla group was well armed, but the element of surprise had been lost. It was at this point that the operation began to unravel. The gunfight lasted for several minutes, and during this time, several members of the guerrilla group were injured. Perez, who had been leading the assault, managed to escape the scene, but the rest of his group was not so fortunate. 2 of his comrades were captured by the police, while another was killed in the exchange of gunfire. The Argentine police and military were quick to respond to the chaos, and soon after the gunfire erupted, they descended upon the area in full force. Despite the failure of the operation, the authorities were still desperate to find the mastermind behind the raid. The fact that the ERP had attempted such an ambitious operation against a high-ranking official made it clear that the group was becoming more organized and more dangerous. The raid served as a clear indication of the growing reach and threat of the ERP and similar guerrilla movements across Latin America. Carlos Perez, though wounded, managed to escape into the urban sprawl of Buenos Aires. He quickly went into hiding, but his name was soon plastered across every newspaper and radio station in the country. The government's response to the failed kidnapping attempt was swift and unforgiving. Authorities immediately launched a nationwide manhunt for Perez and the other members of the ERP involved in the operation. The military Juno was determined to punish those responsible, and this event would only further intensify the crackdown on dissidents. In the days following the attack, the government conducted a series of raids throughout Buenos Aires and the surrounding areas, seeking out known members of the ERP. The Argentine military, with the support of local police, arrested several suspected members of the guerrilla group, while others were forced into hiding. The arrests led to mass trials, many of which were politically charged, and accusations of torture and human rights abuses by the government surfaced in the years that followed. Despite these heavy-handed responses, the ERP continued its activities. While Carlos Perez's actions had drawn significant attention to their cause, they also brought upon the group a brutal wave of retaliation. The government's crackdown on left-wing activists, labor leaders, and anyone associated with the guerrilla movement was severe. Throughout 1971, political dissidents found themselves in increasingly dangerous situations as the government targeted anyone suspected of opposing the military dictatorship. Though Perez's attempt to kidnap General Rodriguez had failed, it was not without lasting effects. The attack marked a turning point in the struggle between the Argentine military and the growing number of leftist guerrilla groups that sought to challenge the government. While Perez and his comrades managed to escape the immediate repercussions, their actions contributed to the intensification of violence that would grip the nation throughout the 1970s. In the aftermath of the attack, the ERP began to shift its tactics. The group, having realized the risks associated with direct assaults on government officials, began to focus more on smaller, clandestine operations such as bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings of less high-profile targets. However, these smaller operations were no less dangerous, and they continued to attract the attention of both the public and the military. Carlos Perez, despite being forced into hiding, would remain a significant figure in the movement. He became a symbol of defiance against the oppressive government and was celebrated by many who opposed the military junta. However, for the government, Perez and others like him represented a threat that needed to be eliminated at all costs. This marked the beginning of an escalating cycle of violence in Argentina, which would culminate in the dirty war La Guerra Sucia, a period of systematic repression by the government from 1976 to 1983. During this time, thousands of suspected dissidents were tortured, disappeared, and killed by the military dictatorship. Although the ERP's efforts were ultimately crushed, their actions set in motion a chain of events that would define Argentina's political landscape for the years to come. As the manhunt for Carlos Perez and the other members of the ERP continued, the political and social divisions in Argentina deepened. The military government's actions in the wake of the March 1971 attack illustrated the extent to which it would go to maintain control over the country, even at the cost of human rights and civil liberties. While Perez and his group were ultimately cornered, the legacy of their actions would leave a lasting impact on Argentina's history. The attack on General Julio Rodriguez and the subsequent manhunt for Carlos Perez and his guerrilla group marked a dramatic shift in Argentina's political climate. While the immediate consequences were devastating for the ERP, the broader impact of this failed kidnapping attempt would resonate throughout the country for years to come. What followed the attack was not just a series of arrests, raids, and government crackdowns, but the beginning of an even darker chapter in Argentina's history. Following the March 1971 raid, Carlos Perez's name became synonymous with resistance and revolution in the eyes of many of Argentina's marginalized communities. His actions, though violent and controversial, were seen by some as an attempt to stand up against an oppressive military regime that had little regard for human rights or political freedoms. For those in the ERP and other left-wing guerrilla organizations, Perez's mission was viewed as a brave act of defiance against a government that ruled with an iron fist. However, the response from the government was one of extreme severity. The Argentine military junta, led by General Alejandro Agustin Lainez, took immediate and decisive action in its attempt to restore order. The crackdown that followed the failed kidnapping was brutal, with the military targeting not only the ERP members, but also anyone associated with left-wing political movements, trade unions or dissident groups. The widespread arrests, torture, and disappearances that followed became a hallmark of the era. The government's response to the ERP and other guerrilla movements was not just about capturing individuals like Perez. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge the military junta. Operation Independencia, a large-scale military operation launched in 1975, was one of the earliest and most significant responses to these challenges. It targeted the rural areas of Argentina, where the ERP had established strongholds. The operation resulted in the forced disappearance of thousands of suspected guerrilla members and sympathizers. Despite the government's efforts to suppress Perez and his group, the influence of the ERP continued to grow in the early 1970s. The group's actions, including the March 1971 kidnapping attempt, revealed a determination to engage in armed resistance rather than relying on political negotiation. This shift marked a transition from more peaceful political activism to revolutionary violence as a means of resistance. Perez, who had gone into hiding after the attack, managed to evade capture for some time. However, like many of his comrades, his fate was sealed once the government launched an all-out war against the left-wing insurgency. By the mid-1970s, the ERP had been all but destroyed, its members either killed, captured, or forced into exile. Perez's ultimate fate, like many other guerrilla fighters, remained shrouded in mystery. Some believe he was captured and executed by the military, while others argue that he escaped into exile, perhaps to another country in Latin America. Regardless, the government's swift and violent retaliation ensured that any hope for a revolutionary victory in Argentina was quickly extinguished. The events surrounding the attack on General Rodriguez became a symbol of the growing tensions between Argentina's military regime and the opposition forces. It demonstrated the government's willingness to go to any lengths to maintain control, including using brutal tactics against its own people. The subsequent suppression of the ERP and other guerrilla movements escalated the violence that would ultimately define the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia. The Dirty War, which officially began in 1976, was a period of state-sponsored terrorism in Argentina. The military junta, which took full control of the country following a coup in 1976, embarked on a systematic campaign of repression against anyone suspected of being associated with left-wing ideologies. Over the course of the Dirty War, between 10,000 and 30,000 people were disappeared, tortured, and killed by the military. This campaign was conducted under the guise of fighting terrorism, but in reality was a ruthless attempt to eliminate any opposition to the military dictatorship. Carlos Perez's actions and the subsequent crackdown on guerrilla groups in the early 1970s can be seen as a precursor to the broader violence of the Dirty War. His kidnapping attempt, although unsuccessful, symbolized the escalating conflict between the state and those who sought to change the political system. It was clear that the military regime was prepared to use extreme measures to silence dissent, and Perez's group, along with other left-wing movements, became prime targets. Although Perez was never publicly captured or tried, his involvement in the ERP left a lasting imprint on Argentine history. The ERP, like many other guerrilla organizations in Latin America, would eventually fade away, but the political and social climate that gave rise to these groups did not disappear. The frustrations of the working class, the poor, and political dissidents continued to simmer beneath the surface, ultimately contributing to the widespread unrest that would later characterize the Dirty War. In the decades that followed, Argentina's military dictatorship was condemned internationally for its human rights abuses. The post-dictatorship government, which came to power after the fall of the junta in 1983, began efforts to address the atrocities committed during the Dirty War. Many former military officers and government officials were tried for their roles in the repression, and the families of the disappeared began to demand justice. Despite these efforts, the legacy of the Dirty War continues to haunt Argentina, as families still search for the truth about the fate of their loved ones. The case of Carlos Perez, his failed kidnapping attempt, and the subsequent crackdown by the military serve as a reminder of the dark period in Argentina's history. The violence that began in the early 1970s paved the way for a decade of fear, repression, and loss. Perez's actions, while part of a broader movement, are emblematic of the struggles faced by those who sought to challenge a regime that, at the time, seemed all-powerful and unyielding. Though his fate remains uncertain, the impact of Perez's actions is undeniable. His story is woven into the fabric of Argentina's turbulent political history, serving as a stark reminder of the lengths to which individuals and governments will go in pursuit of their ideological goals. While Perez himself may have faded from the public eye, the legacy of resistance against dictatorship continues to inspire new generations in Argentina and beyond. The search for truth, justice, and reconciliation remains an ongoing struggle for those who lived through the darkest days of Argentina's past. Let's jump to next story. Story 2. The early 1970s, Argentina was caught in a period of significant political and social turmoil. The country was under the rule of a military junta, and opposition movements were growing more aggressive. Among these movements, one of the most active groups was the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, ERP, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla organization. This group was particularly focused on overthrowing the military government and replacing it with a socialist regime. Their tactics often involved bombings, kidnappings, and attacks on police and military personnel. One of the most notable and significant criminal cases in Argentina in 1972 involved the kidnapping of Victor Hader, a businessman with close ties to the Argentine government. The perpetrators of this crime were members of the ERP, and the event became one of the most well-known kidnappings in Argentine history, setting the stage for further acts of violence in the coming years. Victor Hader, born in the early 1940s, was a prominent figure in Argentina's business community, especially in the field of finance. Hader's involvement in the country's economy and his connections with the military regime made him a target for left-wing militants who viewed him as part of the elite establishment. The ERP believed that targeting wealthy businessmen like Hader would not only create financial pressure on the government, but would also make a political statement. Hader, despite his civilian status, was perceived by many revolutionary groups as a symbol of the capitalist system that they sought to dismantle. The kidnapping occurred on July 20, 1972, and was orchestrated by a small cell of the ERP. The leader of this group was Carlos El Flaco Sanchez, a key figure within the ERP, who had been involved in several earlier attacks against military targets. Sanchez and his comrades had been planning the kidnapping for weeks, choosing Hader as their target because of his close ties with powerful figures within the Argentine government. The group's goal was to demand the release of several imprisoned ERP members who had been arrested during earlier military crackdowns. The operation itself was well planned and executed. On the day of the kidnapping, Hader was leaving his home in Buenos Aires, where he lived with his wife and children. He was getting into his car when the guerrilla group ambushed him. The ERP members had been watching his movements for days, carefully timing the attack to ensure it would be successful. When Hader stepped into his car, a group of armed men surrounded him. They forced him into a waiting vehicle, and Hader was taken to a safe house where he was held captive. The kidnappers communicated their demands to the government shortly after the abduction. They issued a public statement claiming that the businessman's life was at risk unless the Argentine government agreed to release several of their imprisoned comrades. In addition to the demands for prisoner releases, the ERP also requested the withdrawal of military forces from certain regions of the country. These were bold demands, meant not only to secure the release of their members, but also to demonstrate the power of their organization. The abduction of Victor Hader sent shockwaves through the Argentine business and political communities. For the first time, a civilian with significant connections to the government had been targeted by left-wing militants. The ERP's growing ability to strike against powerful individuals represented an escalation in their tactics, moving from mostly military and police targets to civilians who were seen as part of the establishment. This change marked a turning point in the group's campaign, and the Argentine government, already under pressure from other guerrilla groups, found itself struggling to respond to this new threat. Hader's kidnapping was not the first of its kind, but it was among the most high-profile. In 1971, the ERP had already carried out the kidnapping of a military officer, but the attack on Hader was different because it was directed at someone who was not directly involved in the military or government. The attack was an indication that the ERP was willing to escalate its actions in an attempt to exert greater pressure on the government. This shift in strategy would lead to an increase in violent acts across the country in the years that followed. The government, led by President Juan Carlos Anguini at the time, responded quickly and harshly. Military units and police forces were deployed across Buenos Aires to search for the kidnappers. The government also began negotiating with the ERP, though they were determined not to give in to their demands. Despite their efforts, the ERP was not willing to release Hader without the promised concessions, and the situation soon became a tense standoff between the guerrillas and the government. As the days went by, the urgency of the situation grew. Hader's family, meanwhile, was under intense pressure. His wife and children were subjected to media scrutiny, and many began to question the motivations behind the kidnapping. Some sympathized with the ERP's political objectives, while others viewed the act as an example of unnecessary violence against innocent people. The story of Hader's abduction became a national issue, dominating the news in Argentina and drawing the attention of international media. In the meantime, the ERP continued to make demands through intermediaries, insisting that the government take their conditions seriously. The group believed that the abduction would force the government to negotiate, and they were willing to use Hader's life as leverage. As the deadline for the release of prisoners approached, tensions escalated, and it became increasingly unclear whether Hader would survive the ordeal. As the hours passed, the situation surrounding the kidnapping of Victor Hader grew more tense. On one hand, the ERP members who held Hader believed their demands would force the government into a compromise. On the other hand, the Argentine military government was determined not to give in to the pressure, especially after witnessing the group's audacity. The case quickly became a high-stakes chess game, with both sides maneuvering for control. The Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, ERP, had taken a calculated risk by kidnapping a civilian with close ties to the government. For the ERP, Hader's status as a businessman, who represented the capitalist elite, made him the perfect symbolic figure. They intended to use him as a bargaining chip to demand the release of their comrades and to send a powerful message to the Argentine government. They would not hesitate to strike where it hurt the most. For the ERP, the kidnapping represented a shift toward targeting the civilian elite, those in power who supported the regime, directly or indirectly. It was a message that the insurgency was gaining strength and would stop at nothing to further its cause. The group's leader Carlos El Flaco Sanchez and his comrades had been preparing for weeks, carefully planning each detail. The safe house where Haider was held was located in a remote part of Buenos Aires, far from the prying eyes of law enforcement. The ERP members took every precaution to ensure they wouldn't be discovered, but they also knew that their time was limited. They could not afford to keep Haider for long, as the government's forces would inevitably close in on their location. As news of the kidnapping spread throughout the country, the Argentine government began taking immediate action. President Juan Carlos Anguina's administration was already under immense pressure, with the country's political instability growing daily. Military and police forces were put on high alert, and the security agencies immediately launched an extensive manhunt for the perpetrators. Argentina's police force and military intelligence began combing Buenos Aires and its outskirts, hoping to track down the kidnappers and liberate Haider before it was too late. Behind the scenes, government officials and military leaders were divided on how to handle the situation. Some advocated for direct negotiations, hoping to resolve the crisis peacefully, while others argued that giving in to the ERP's demands would be disastrous and set a dangerous precedent for future abductions. The Argentine government's refusal to negotiate with terrorists, as it was often called, was a key factor in its decision to take a hardline approach. Meanwhile, Haider remained in captivity, isolated from the outside world. The ERP used this time to send a clear message to the public by releasing statements demanding the release of their comrades and insisting that the government meet their terms. The government, in turn, made it clear that they would not negotiate with what they considered to be criminal elements. As the deadline for their demands approached, the tension surrounding the situation reached new heights. To complicate matters, Haider's family, especially his wife, was under intense pressure. The media storm surrounding the kidnapping added another layer of stress, with the press following every development. While some sympathized with the family, many others in the public viewed the abduction with a sense of fear and resentment. Haider's kidnapping was the latest in a series of high-profile attacks that had been carried out by left-wing militants in Argentina, and the public's patience was wearing thin. On July 22nd, just 2 days after Haider's abduction, the ERP sent a recorded message to the government and the press. The message, released through an intermediary, reiterated their demands for the release of their imprisoned members. They also warned that if their terms were not met within a set time frame, Haider's life would be in danger. The ERP's leaders made it clear that they were serious about their threats and that they were prepared to follow through on their warnings. The message amplified the sense of urgency surrounding the crisis. Haider's family was in a state of despair, and the government was under intense pressure to either negotiate or take action. The Argentine public, who had already been grappling with the growing violence in the country, was increasingly divided. Some were sympathetic to the ERP's cause, believing that the government's repressive tactics justified resistance, while others feared the consequences of negotiating with militants who had already demonstrated their willingness to resort to extreme measures. The ERP's demands, while aimed at securing the release of their comrades, were also a reflection of their broader goals, to bring down the military government and institute a socialist state. By targeting civilians like Haider, the ERP sought to weaken the government's support base and demonstrate that the ruling elite was not immune to attack. The message was clear: no one, no matter how powerful, was safe from their revolutionary struggle. In the face of mounting pressure, President Anguina and his advisors began to reconsider their options. Negotiating with the ERP, however, was seen as a risky proposition that could set a dangerous precedent. On the other hand, allowing Haider to be harmed or killed by the militants would send a signal of weakness, and the government feared that it would embolden the ERP and other guerrilla groups. There were also concerns that if Haider was killed, the military and police might take retribution on ERP members and their families, leading to an even greater cycle of violence. The next few days would be crucial, not only for Haider's life, but for the future of the ERP's insurgency. As the government continued to debate its options, the ERP's leadership, including Carlos Sanchez, understood that their window for action was closing. They had no choice but to push their demands harder, knowing that any compromise could weaken their position. In the meantime, Haider was held in isolation. His condition remained unknown to the public, but his family continued to hope for his safe return. The government's response remained unclear, and it was uncertain whether negotiations would begin or if they would continue to refuse the ERP's demand. What was clear, however, was that the country was on the brink of a crisis that would have lasting consequences. The standoff between the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, ERP, and the Argentine government regarding the kidnapping of Victor Hader reached its climax in the days that followed the ERP's ultimatum. With the deadline set and no clear indication that the government would relent, the tension in Argentina was palpable. The ERP's message was clear. Their demands for the release of their imprisoned comrades would not be ignored, and they were ready to escalate the situation if necessary. The government, however, had firmly stated its position against negotiation, declaring that it would not yield to terrorist demands. This set the stage for a tragic conclusion. On July 24, 1972, after several days of tense negotiations and military operations aimed at tracking down the kidnappers, the ERP's threats were tragically realized. The Argentine military, which had been closing in on the ERP's safe house, discovered the location where Hader was being held captive. Unfortunately, in the process of rescuing him, Hader was killed. The exact circumstances surrounding his death remain unclear, but the ERP's failure to release him as promised, along with the government's inability to secure his safe return, led to the unfortunate and tragic loss of life. The aftermath of Hader's death reverberated throughout Argentina. The ERP's kidnapping had already attracted significant attention, but the failure of both sides to reach an agreement over the release of Hader demonstrated the increasing polarization in the country. The Argentine government, while determined not to give in to militants, faced widespread condemnation for its role in the tragic outcome. Hader's family was devastated by the news of his death, and public opinion was divided. While many viewed the ERP's actions as extreme, others saw them as a reflection of the widespread anger at the military junta and the growing repression faced by left-wing activists. In the wake of Hader's death, the Argentine government escalated its crackdown on the ERP and similar guerrilla groups. The military launched a series of operations designed to dismantle the ERP's infrastructure, which included raids, arrests, and mass imprisonments. Many suspected ERP members were taken into custody, some of whom faced brutal interrogations and torture. This aggressive response was part of the military's broader strategy to maintain control and prevent further acts of terrorism and insurgency. Despite the Argentine military's efforts to eliminate the ERP, the group's ideology and actions were far from extinguished. The failure to secure Hader's release only galvanized the ERP's members and supporters. For many in the left-wing opposition, the government's actions were seen as proof of its brutality and unwillingness to engage in dialogue. The ERP would continue its campaign of violence throughout the 1970s, eventually contributing to the rise of Argentina's notorious dirty war, La Guerra Sucia, during which thousands of suspected left-wing militants and dissidents were arrested, tortured, and disappeared. Hader's kidnapping and death, though part of a broader conflict between revolutionary guerrillas and the Argentine military regime, marked a significant point in the history of political violence in the country. The event illustrated the growing scale of militancy on both sides and the deepening political polarization. It also highlighted the lengths to which revolutionary groups like the ERP were willing to go to challenge the military government, as well as the government's determination to use force to suppress any form of opposition. Victor Hader's tragic fate would be remembered as part of the broader narrative of violence and repression that defined Argentina's political landscape in the 1970s. His abduction marked one of the first high-profile cases where a civilian, with no direct military involvement, was targeted by left-wing guerrillas. This signaled a shift in the ERP's strategy, which would later influence the group's subsequent actions. The ERP, and other groups like the Montoneros, would continue to engage in violent acts against both military targets and civilians in an attempt to destabilize the government. While the Argentine military government continued to crack down on guerrilla organizations, it also became increasingly authoritarian, resorting to violent methods to silence any opposition. This contributed to the human rights abuses and widespread fear that characterized the Dirty War. In this period, the government justified its actions as a necessary fight against terrorism, but in reality, it led to the disappearance of thousands of people, many of whom were innocent civilians. The case of Victor Hader remains one of the many painful reminders of the intense political and social struggles that marked Argentina's history in the 1970s. The failure of the Argentine government to negotiate with guerrilla groups, combined with the ERP's willingness to resort to extreme violence, set the stage for the deepening cycle of conflict and repression that would define the country for years. Hader's family never fully recovered from their loss, and his death became part of the painful legacy of the political violence that shaped Argentina's tumultuous decade. In the decades since the Dirty War, Argentina has slowly started to reckon with its past. The trial and prosecution of former military officers for human rights abuses has become an important part of the country's efforts toward justice and reconciliation. However, the scars of the 1970s remain, and events like Hader's kidnapping continued to serve as a reminder of the dangers of political extremism, both from the government and revolutionary groups. His abduction and the tragic outcome underscored the devastating consequences of the deep political divisions that define this era of Argentina's history. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In 1973, Argentina was deeply embroiled in political unrest. The country had witnessed a series of violent confrontations between the state and various revolutionary groups, with the growing presence of left-wing guerrilla movements. Among these groups was the Montoneros, an armed militant organization that sought to overthrow the military government and implement a Marxist-Leninist agenda. The Montoneros were one of the most powerful and well-organized groups during this period, and their actions would have a lasting impact on Argentina's political climate. One of the most significant events in Argentina in 1973 was the kidnapping of General Omar de la Colina, a senior officer in the Argentine army. The abduction of General de la Colina was carried out by the Montoneros, and it reflected their growing strength and willingness to take bold actions to achieve their political objectives. De la Colina, who had been involved in the brutal repression of left-wing activists in previous years, was seen as an enemy by the revolutionary left. For the Montoneros, his kidnapping was not just a strategic move, but a statement against the military regime, which they blamed for the ongoing violence and human rights abuses in the country. De la Colina's abduction occurred against the backdrop of Argentina's unstable political environment. In 1973, Argentina was on the brink of another transition in power, as Juan Domingo Perón, the country's former president and leader of the Peronist movement, was preparing to return to the country after years of exile. Perón's return to power was highly anticipated by his supporters, but it also heightened tensions between the military, left-wing groups like the Montoneros, and other political factions. The military viewed the Peronist movement as a threat to their power, and the left-wing groups saw it as a potential opportunity to further their goals of revolution. Amid these tensions, the kidnapping of General de la Colina was a clear sign that the Montoneros were willing to take extreme measures to challenge the state. The man behind the kidnapping operation was Mario Firmenich, one of the top leaders of the Montoneros. Firmenich, a former student radical who became one of the most notorious figures in the organization, was known for his tactical brilliance and ruthless determination. His leadership was crucial in the planning and execution of the kidnapping. Under his command, the Montoneros carried out several operations against military and police officers, aiming to disrupt the power structure and weaken the military government's grip on Argentina. The kidnapping was carried out on March 9, 1973. General de la Colina had been on a routine visit to one of the military bases near Buenos Aires when the Montoneros' cell struck. The group had been monitoring de la Colina's movements for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the general's convoy was driving through a relatively quiet and less policed area of the city, the Montoneros sprung into action. Several armed men, dressed in military uniforms, blocked the road and ambushed the convoy. The attack was swift and precise, with de la Colina being abducted without a shot fired. The kidnapping was a high-profile act of defiance, and the Montoneros quickly took credit for it. They released a statement demanding the release of political prisoners, including several of their comrades who had been imprisoned by the military regime. The Montoneros had previously used kidnapping as a tactic to gain leverage in their struggle, and this was just another step in their broader campaign against the military dictatorship. For the Argentine government, the abduction of General de la Colina was a major blow. The military, which had been engaged in a bitter fight against revolutionary groups, found itself in a situation where it could not simply rely on brute force to resolve the problem. The government responded by mobilizing its security forces to locate and free the general. However, their efforts were complicated by the highly organized and elusive nature of the Montoneros. The group had a network of safe houses, sympathizers, and supporters throughout Buenos Aires and other major cities, which made it difficult for the military to track them down. The kidnapping also put the government in a difficult position politically. If they refused to negotiate with the Montoneros, it would signal a hardline approach, which could alienate some segments of the population, especially those sympathetic to left-wing causes. On the other hand, if they negotiated or made concessions, it would send a message that the military government was vulnerable to the tactics of revolutionary groups. As the days passed, it became clear that the situation was spiraling out of control, and the Argentine public became increasingly anxious about the potential outcome. The Montoneros, for their part, knew that the abduction of such a high-ranking officer would draw attention to their cause. They believed that kidnapping military leaders like General de la Colina would undermine the legitimacy of the military government and show the world that they were capable of striking at the heart of the establishment. The Montoneros also understood that their actions were fueling the fire of revolution. They believed that their movement had the support of large segments of the Argentine population who were fed up with the military dictatorship's repression, and the kidnapping was their way of demonstrating that they were serious in their fight for change. For the Argentine military, the situation was becoming increasingly perilous. The kidnapping was not just a military defeat, it was a direct challenge to their authority. The Montoneros had struck at a key figure in the government's power structure, and the events symbolized the growing influence of the left-wing insurgents. The military was faced with a dilemma. How could they respond to the Montoneros without creating a situation that would further fuel the insurgency? Military officials were also concerned about the potential for further kidnappings and attacks, which could destabilize the government even more. The situation was one of escalating tension, and the risk of further violence was high. As the days passed, the focus of the entire country shifted to the fate of General de la Colina. The military government was under intense pressure to rescue him, while the Montoneros were determined to use him as leverage in their ongoing struggle against the state. What happened next would set the stage for a violent escalation in the conflict and further deepen the political divisions in Argentina, leading the country to the brink of another brutal chapter in its history. The kidnapping of General de la Colina by the Montoneros marked a pivotal moment in the escalation of political violence in Argentina. As the standoff continued, the situation grew more complex and the country's political landscape became even more volatile. The military government led by Alejandro Agustin Lainez was faced with a difficult decision: negotiate with the Montoneros or risk the safety of a high-ranking officer and give in to the pressures of armed insurgents. Initially, the government tried to take a hardline stance, refusing to negotiate with the Montoneros. Military and security forces were mobilized to locate and rescue General de la Colina. However, as the days passed, it became clear that the Montoneros were no ordinary guerrilla group. They had well-developed strategies, robust networks, and a deep understanding of the military's operations. The government's inability to locate de la Colina and the Montoneros' ability to remain elusive only increased the pressure on the regime. The tension surrounding the kidnapping also grew as public support for the Montoneros remained strong among certain sectors of Argentine society. Many in the working class and among left-wing political factions saw the Montoneros as the voice of resistance against the military dictatorship. The Peronist movement, which had long struggled to find its place within Argentina's political structure, found common ground with the Montoneros against the military regime. Their mutual opposition to military rule, alongside the growing repression from the government, laid the foundation for the political chaos that would unfold. By March 12, 1973, as the deadline set by the Montoneros for the release of political prisoners passed, the situation reached its breaking point. The Montoneros had made their demands clear: the release of prisoners held by the military regime and an end to the systematic repression of left-wing activists. They had also made it clear that if their demands were not met, the general would face dire consequences. The government, however, remained resolute in its refusal to negotiate, viewing the demands of the Montoneros as a form of terrorism rather than legitimate political discourse. In the face of the deadlock, the Montoneros decided to take further action. On March 13, 1973, they released a statement claiming responsibility for the kidnapping of General de la Colina and warning the government of the dire consequences if their demands were not met. In the statement, the Montoneros vowed that their struggle against the military would continue and escalate. They also hinted at the possibility of using more high-profile figures as targets in the future if the government did not comply. The public response to this message was mixed. While some supported the Monteneros' resistance against the dictatorship, many others feared that the growing violence would lead to even more instability and bloodshed. The military, meanwhile, was under intense pressure to take action. With General de la Colina still in captivity and his life hanging in the balance, the government began to consider all options. In an attempt to break the deadlock, they increased their military presence in Buenos Aires and surrounding areas, deploying intelligence resources to track down the guerrillas. However, the Monteneros were highly organized, and their ability to operate in secret made it difficult for the government to gain an upper hand. On March 15th, a major military operation was launched in an attempt to free General de la Colina. Armed forces and security personnel stormed several safe houses across Buenos Aires that were suspected to be linked to the Monteneros. However, despite their efforts, the operation ended in failure. The Monteneros had anticipated such a move and had already relocated their leader, along with the general, to a different location. The military's failure to locate them only served to increase the Monteneros' standing as a formidable force within the country's broader revolutionary movement. In the midst of the operation, a second, unexpected event occurred. On March 16th, as the military ramped up its search efforts, Juan Domingo Perón returned to Argentina after years of exile. Perón, who had led the country for several terms in the past, had been living in Spain since his ouster in 1955. His return to Argentina was met with both excitement and anxiety. For many, Perón's return signaled a potential shift in power, as he was seen as a unifying figure for the Peronist movement. His re-entry into the country further complicated the situation, as the military and left-wing guerrilla groups alike understood that his return could alter the balance of power. The government, already under pressure from the Monteneros, now had to face the political implications of Perón's return. While many Argentinians supported Perón's return, his alignment with the left-wing factions and the potential shift in the balance of power only made the political landscape more unpredictable. The Monteneros, who had their roots in the Peronist movement, saw Perón's return as a significant development, and they believed that his leadership could eventually help in their struggle against the military regime. The power vacuum created by Perón's return would add a layer of uncertainty, and both the military and the Monteneros began to reevaluate their strategies in light of this new development. By March 18, 1973, the standoff had taken an irreversible turn. General de la Colina, who had been held captive for over a week, was found dead in a safe house in Buenos Aires. The Monteneros had executed him, following through on their threats to kill him if their demands were not met. The military government, already struggling to maintain control, now had to face the harsh reality of the situation. One of their senior officers had been murdered, and the political crisis in the country had escalated beyond repair. The execution of General de la Colina marked the start of an even more violent chapter in Argentina's history. The government responded by increasing its repression of left-wing activists, while the Monteneros escalated their attacks against military and police targets. The cycle of violence would continue throughout the 1970s as the country descended into a brutal period of political conflict. The kidnapping and eventual death of General de la Colina had been a catalyst, setting in motion a series of events that would lead to the dirty war, La Guerra Sucia, a period of extreme state violence during which thousands of suspected leftists, activists, and dissidents would be disappeared, tortured, and killed. The Monteneros' campaign of violence, despite its early successes, ultimately proved to be unsustainable. In the following years, their ranks would dwindle as the military government's crackdown intensified. However, the events of 1973, including the kidnapping and death of General de la Colina, left a lasting legacy on Argentina's political landscape. They served as a grim reminder of the escalating violence that would define the next decade of Argentine history and solidified the place of the Monteneros in the annals of the country's revolutionary movement. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. Year 1974 in Argentina was marked by deep political turmoil and instability. By this time, the country had experienced years of military dictatorship, political repression, and growing tensions between revolutionary groups and the military regime. One of the most prominent groups leading this insurgency was the Monteneros, a left-wing guerrilla organization that had been involved in numerous violent acts, including kidnappings, assassinations, and bombing. In addition to the Montoneros, other militant organizations, such as the People's Revolutionary Army, (PRP), also played significant roles in the country's increasingly violent political landscape. In 1974, Argentina was at a crossroads. The government, led by Juan Domingo Perón, had come to power once again after returning from exile. Perón, a populist leader, had long been a dominant figure in Argentine politics, but his return was met with mixed reactions. While his followers welcomed his comeback, his political approach, especially in terms of dealing with revolutionary groups, was highly controversial. Perón's government sought to balance support from both left-wing factions and the military, which made the situation increasingly fragile. One of the key events in 1970, for that would further exacerbate the country's political tensions, was the assassination of José Ignacio Rucci, a Union leader who was close to Perón. His death, carried out by the Peronist left-wing militants, particularly the Montoneros, would spark a violent wave of political unrest, deepening the rift between the Peronist movement's factions and further polarizing Argentina's political atmosphere. Rucci was a prominent figure in Argentina's labor movement and was also a strong ally of Perón. He had served as the leader of the General Confederation of Labor, CGT, which represented a broad segment of Argentina's working class. The CGT was instrumental in Perón's rise to power, and Rucci's influence within the organization gave him significant political power. However, his close ties to Perón and the more conservative elements of the Peronist movement made him a target for the Montoneros and other left-wing militants. The Montoneros, who were deeply opposed to Perón's policies, viewed Rucci as a symbol of the establishment that they sought to overthrow. In their eyes, Rucci had become a traitor to the ideals of Juan Perón, whom they believed had abandoned his revolutionary roots. They accused Rucci of betraying the working class by aligning with Perón's more conservative policies, which they felt favored the military and corporate elites. This ideological divide led to growing tensions between the Peronist left and the more traditional Peronist right, with the Montoneros seeing the assassination of Rucci as a way to strike a blow against the old political order. On September 25, 1974, the Montoneros executed their plan to assassinate José Ignacio Rucci. The assassination took place in Buenos Aires, where Rucci was returning home after a meeting. As he was stepping out of his car near his residence, a group of Montoneros militants ambushed him. The attack was swift and brutal. Rucci was shot multiple times, and the assailants quickly fled the scene before the police could respond. The murder was a direct blow to the Peronist movement and had a profound effect on the Argentine political landscape. Rucci's assassination was a shock to the nation, and it had far-reaching consequences. Perón's government, which had already been struggling to maintain control over the political factions within the Peronist movement, was severely destabilized. The murder of such a prominent figure within the movement further divided the country, leading to increased violence from both the left-wing guerrillas and the right-wing military factions. The Montoneros claimed responsibility for the assassination, issuing a statement that justified their actions as part of their revolutionary struggle. They saw Rucci's death as a necessary step in dismantling the old Peronist order and making way for a more radical, socialist vision of Argentina's future. The aftermath of the assassination saw an immediate reaction from both the military and the Peronist government. The military, which had already been increasingly supportive of Perón's administration, saw the Montoneros' actions as a direct challenge to the state's authority. In the days following the assassination, the military escalated its operations against left-wing guerrillas. The Peronist government under Perón, who was already in poor health, found itself in a difficult position. Torn between appeasing left-wing factions and maintaining order within the Peronist movement's more conservative ranks. Perón himself, dealing with his own declining health and political influence, struggled to assert control. At the same time, the Montoneros continued to justify their actions as part of a larger revolutionary struggle. In their view, the assassination of Rucci was not a random act of violence, but rather a political statement meant to galvanize the working class against the capitalist establishment that they accused Rucci of supporting. The Montoneros believed that Perón had strayed from his original promises of social justice, and that the only way to bring about true change was through armed struggle. As the Montoneros and other left-wing factions gained strength, the situation in Argentina grew increasingly volatile. Perón began to lose control over both the Montoneros and his own government. His presidency was marked by constant internal conflicts, and by 1975, the country was on the brink of total collapse. The assassination of José Ignacio Rucci was a turning point in this process. It set in motion a series of events that would escalate the violence and repression that would dominate Argentina in the years to come. The assassination also had a significant impact on Argentina's political culture. It intensified the sense of polarization between the left-wing revolutionary factions and the right-wing military forces. As a result, the country's social and political fabric began to tear apart, with various factions using violence to achieve their goals. The assassination of Rucci was not just the killing of a single individual, but a pivotal moment that marked the intensification of political violence and set the stage for the dirty war, La Guerra Sucia, which would erupt just a year later in 1976. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, the military responded with an overwhelming crackdown on suspected left-wing militants, including members of the Montoneros. These early measures laid the groundwork for the Dirty War, a period of state-sponsored terror that saw the disappearance and killing of thousands of suspected political opponents. While the Montoneros continued their armed struggle, the military dictatorship would soon take full control of the government, launching an aggressive campaign to suppress all forms of dissent. The assassination of José Ignacio Rucci on September 25, 1974, was not just a tragic loss for the Peronist movement, but a key moment that ignited further political polarization and violence in Argentina. In the immediate aftermath of the killing, the country witnessed a sharp escalation of violent conflict. The left-wing Montoneros were emboldened by their successful operation, seeing the murder as a symbol of their revolutionary cause. The attack was part of their ongoing campaign to weaken the military-backed government and to push Argentina toward a more radical leftist agenda. However, the assassination also solidified the government's resolve to crush the growing insurgency, marking the beginning of a vicious cycle of political violence. In the wake of Rucci's assassination, President Juan Domingo Perón, already frail due to his failing health, struggled to maintain control over the country. The violence within the Peronist movement itself was tearing the organization apart. Perón's leadership was increasingly challenged from both sides, with factions of the Peronist left led by the Montoneros demanding a more revolutionary agenda, while the Peronist right, allied with the military, favored maintaining the status quo and curbing left-wing insurgencies. This internal rift made the political environment in Argentina even more unstable. The military, which had long been a powerful force in Argentina's political landscape, also reacted strongly to the assassination. They viewed the killing of Rucci as an assault not only on Perón's government, but on the state itself. The Argentine military responded with force, beginning a nationwide crackdown against left-wing activists and suspected insurgents. This led to a series of escalating operations to capture or eliminate members of guerrilla groups like the Montoneros. The military's response to the assassination was brutal and unrelenting, marking the beginning of a more intense campaign of violence that would eventually escalate into the Dirty War. The growing violence and repression following Rucci's death were compounded by the Peronist infighting. The left-wing factions of the Peronist movement, particularly the Montoneros, felt that Perón was betraying his revolutionary principles by tolerating the increasing involvement of the military in government affairs. In their view, the Peronist government had abandoned its original commitment to social justice and worker empowerment. They believed that Perón's alliance with the military was a step towards fascism, and they feared that the president's inability to rein in the military would lead to even greater oppression of the working class and the poor. The Peronist right, on the other hand, viewed the Montoneros' violence as a direct threat to the stability of the country and to the social order. They argued that the insurgent movements were undermining Argentina's economic and social progress, and that their actions would only bring about chaos. This faction believed that the military had to play a leading role in restoring order and combating the left-wing terrorism that had been escalating since the 1960s. Perón himself, exhausted and weakened by his failing health, struggled to manage these opposing factions within his own movement. As his condition worsened, the power struggle within the Peronist camp became even more pronounced. Despite the government's efforts to suppress the Montoneros and their allies, the left-wing insurgency continued to grow in strength and frequency. The Montoneros continued to carry out bold operations against the government and military targets. They launched bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations, threatening to destroy the country's infrastructure. However, the military responded with brutality, seizing power quickly and destroying the militia's including the killing of high-ranking military officers. These actions, though successful in destabilizing the government, also provoked increasingly severe repressive measures from the state. At the same time, the military junta began to take a more prominent role in national governance. In 1975, after Perón's death, the military assumed more direct control over the country's government, increasing their efforts to eliminate all forms of resistance. The political violence reached a new height in 1976 when the military dictatorship formally seized power, marking the start of the Dirty War. During the Dirty War, the military junta engaged in widespread human rights abuses, including the abduction, torture, and murder of thousands of suspected left-wing activists and political opponents. The Montoneros, despite their earlier successes, were all but defeated in this period, with many of their members either killed, disappeared, or forced into exile. The Peronist left and other left-wing guerrilla groups were decimated by the military's counterinsurgency operations, which aimed to wipe out any resistance to the dictatorship's rule. The effects of José Ignacio Rucci's assassination were long-lasting. Not only did it deepen the political polarization in Argentina, but it also symbolized the deep divide within the Peronist movement itself. The split between the revolutionary left and the military-aligned right would continue to haunt Argentina in the years to come. The conflict sparked by Rucci's murder helped set the stage for the brutal repression that would follow. And the consequences of these violent actions would shape Argentina's future for decades. In the aftermath of Rucci's assassination, the Montoneros continued their armed struggle, but their influence began to wane as the military junta cracked down on all forms of dissent. The events of 1970 also marked the beginning of the end for the Peronist movement as it had been known. The assassination, the infighting, and the growing violence shattered the country's political fabric, leaving Argentina on the brink of the dictatorship that would rule with an iron fist for much of the next decade. For the military, the murder of Rucci represented a victory for the left-wing insurgents, but it also served as a reminder of their vulnerability. The government's inability to stop the violence only solidified the military's belief that a hardline approach was necessary to restore order. As the country plunged deeper into crisis, the military's increasing grip on power became inevitable. For the Montoneros, the assassination of José Ignacio Rucci was a significant blow to the Peronist establishment, but it also signaled the beginning of a new phase in their struggle, one that would culminate in the full-scale military repression that would characterize the Dirty War. The tragic and violent events of 1974 had a profound impact on Argentina's future, setting the stage for the extreme brutality of the military dictatorship and the widespread human rights violations that would follow. The assassination of José Ignacio Rucci, an act of political violence with far-reaching consequences, marked a turning point in Argentina's turbulent history and is remembered as one of the key moments that triggered the Dirty War and the violent crackdown that would continue throughout the 1970s and beyond. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In 1975, Argentina was in the midst of a period marked by intense political and social upheaval. The country was teetering on the brink of a deep political crisis as it grappled with rampant violence, economic instability, and an increasingly divided society. The military junta had begun to increase its influence, and left-wing guerrilla groups like the Montoneros and People's Revolutionary Army, ERP, were gaining strength. These groups, which had been operating in the shadows for years, aimed to overthrow the military and the government, establishing a socialist system. The key event that transpired in 1975 was the assassination of Lieutenant General Juan Carlos Sanchez, an influential figure within the Argentine military and the chief of the army. Sanchez was a powerful leader who had extensive ties to the military's operations in the ongoing counterinsurgency efforts against the left-wing groups. As the head of the army, he held considerable influence over the military's response to the growing guerrilla insurgencies. Sanchez was known for his ruthless approach to suppressing dissent and left-wing political movements. His uncompromising stance made him a target for organizations like the Montoneros and the ERP, who viewed him as a key figure in the repression of the working-class movements and revolutionary groups. The Montoneros, a left-wing urban guerrilla group, had been active in Argentina for years. They carried out bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings as part of their efforts to destabilize the government and incite a revolutionary movement. The ERP, a Marxist guerrilla organization that emerged in the late 1960s, also targeted high-ranking military and political figures. These groups saw the military junta as the embodiment of oppression and sought to weaken its grip on power by eliminating its key leaders. Their ideologies were centered around Marxism, and they viewed armed struggle as the only means to achieve their vision of a socialist Argentina. By 1975, the military junta had started to increase its crackdown on insurgent groups, leading to a significant uptick in military operations against revolutionary factions. General Sanchez, as the head of the army, had been directly involved in these operations. Under his leadership, the military had executed harsh tactics, including torture, abductions, and assassinations, in efforts to rid the country of what the hunted deemed subversive. He was a staunch advocate of anti-communist policies and saw left-wing guerrillas as a threat that needed to be eradicated at any cost. His policies and actions made him a polarizing figure in the country. He was seen as a hero by the right-wing and military supporters, but a villain by leftist groups who viewed his methods as brutal and oppressive. The Montoneros had already made several attempts to assassinate high-ranking military officers by 1975. Their acts of violence were aimed at dismantling the military and the capitalist system that they believed was responsible for the oppression of the working class. The assassination of General Sanchez was the culmination of the Montoneros' long-standing vendetta against the military and their belief that violent revolution was necessary to transform Argentina into a socialist state. They viewed the death of Sanchez as a critical blow to the military's power structure and a way to weaken the government's ability to wage war against revolutionary forces. The Montoneros' tactics were not without controversy. The group's reliance on violence to achieve political change had polarized public opinion. Supporters viewed them as freedom fighters standing up to a brutal and repressive regime, while opponents saw them as terrorists undermining the nation's stability. The assassination of General Sanchez was expected to spark a wave of violence and reprisals from the military, which was already on high alert after several earlier attacks. The country was increasingly becoming a battleground, with both sides engaging in increasingly brutal acts of violence. The escalation of political violence was setting the stage for what would soon become the infamous Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia, a period during which the military regime would systematically target left-wing activists, dissidents, and anyone perceived as a threat to the state. In the early months of 1975, the political situation in Argentina was rapidly deteriorating. Juan Domingo Perón, the populist leader who had been re-elected president, had died in July 1974, leaving a power vacuum in the government. His wife, Isabel Perón, had assumed the presidency, but she was ill-equipped to handle the challenges facing the country. The government, weakened by infighting, and the ongoing political violence struggled to maintain control. Isabel Perón's government was characterized by its inability to resolve the growing conflict between the military and left-wing guerrillas. This instability only added to the already volatile atmosphere in Argentina, paving the way for more aggressive military actions against the left. As the military sought to gain the upper hand, a series of operations were launched in early 1975 to clamp down on guerrilla activity. These operations, which were largely unsuccessful in neutralizing the insurgent threat, were only escalating the violence further. The Montoneros and other left-wing groups felt emboldened, believing that their actions were beginning to have a significant impact on the government's ability to function. The assassination of General Sanchez was seen as a major victory in the guerrilla war, a symbol that the left was beginning to make headway in their efforts to overthrow the government and military. The Sanchez assassination was carried out on May 25, 1975 by Montoneros militants. Sanchez had been a prominent target for the group due to his direct involvement in the military's counterinsurgency operations. In the early hours of that morning, a group of armed militants ambushed General Sanchez's convoy as he was traveling through Buenos Aires. The attack was swift and highly coordinated. Sanchez's vehicle was surrounded, and the militants opened fire, killing him instantly. The Montoneros then took responsibility for the attack, issuing a statement justifying their actions as part of their ongoing revolutionary struggle against the military dictatorship. They declared that Sanchez's death was a necessary step to destabilize the military regime and weaken its ability to fight the growing guerrilla movement. This assassination had a profound impact on both the military regime and the civilian population. For the military, it was a direct assault on their authority. General Sanchez had been seen as a key figure in the military's operations, and his death symbolized a shift in the balance of power. It sent a strong message to the regime that no figure, no matter how high-ranking, was safe from. The revolutionary forces. The government, already struggling to maintain control, was forced to respond quickly. The military junta immediately launched a series of retaliatory strikes against known left-wing sympathizers, guerrilla cells, and anyone suspected of being involved in the attack. The death of General Sanchez became one of the catalysts for a wider crackdown on suspected insurgents, which would escalate dramatically in the years to come. The assassination of General Sanchez became a critical turning point in the ongoing conflict between the Argentine military and the revolutionary left. It marked the beginning of a new, more violent phase in the political struggle that would culminate in the Dirty War, a period marked by mass disappearances, torture, and the systematic targeting of left-wing activists, intellectuals, and political opponents. It is during this time that the military would begin its systematic campaign to eliminate any opposition, paving the way for what would become one of the most brutal and repressive periods in Argentina's history. The death of General Sanchez would come to symbolize the escalating violence and the increasing political polarization that marked Argentina in 1975. His assassination, like many others during this period, was not just an isolated event, but a part of a broader political struggle that would leave scars on the nation for decades to come. The assassination of General Juan Carlos Sanchez on May 25, 1975 had profound and far-reaching consequences in Argentina, both for the military government and for the country as a whole. Sanchez's death marked a pivotal moment in the escalating violence and political turmoil that would soon engulf the nation. While his assassination was a significant tactical success for the Montoneros, it also led to devastating consequences, further exacerbating the tension between revolutionary groups and the Argentine state. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, the military junta responded with swift and severe measures. The assassination of such a high-ranking military officer sent shockwaves through the Argentine military establishment. The reactionary response to the killing came swiftly, with the junta beginning a series of retaliatory operations aimed at crushing the growing guerrilla insurgency. As a result, the military escalated its counterinsurgency efforts, launching an all-out assault on the Montoneros, ERP, and any other left-wing factions that were perceived to be a threat to the government. The military's retaliation after Sanchez's assassination marked the beginning of the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia. Over the course of the following months and years, Argentina would plunge into one of the most brutal and repressive periods in its history. Thousands of individuals, from guerrilla fighters to civilians suspected of sympathizing with left-wing causes, would be disappeared, tortured, and executed by the military regime. The Dirty War represented the Argentine military's systematic attempt to eliminate all political opposition, including those aligned with left-wing ideologies and even moderate critics of the government. Although the Montoneros viewed Sanchez's assassination as a success in their broader struggle against the military dictatorship, the event came at a tremendous cost. The military junta, in response to such attacks, began a widespread purge across Argentina. In addition to the military crackdown, civilian populations perceived as sympathizers or supporters of the guerrilla movements became targets. The government started conducting indiscriminate arrests, torture, and other acts of repression, leading to the disappearance of thousands of people during the Dirty War. Many individuals were rounded up without trial or evidence and taken to secret detention centers, where they were subjected to unspeakable acts of torture and brutality. The events that followed Sanchez's death in 1975 marked a decisive shift in Argentina's political trajectory. The growing polarization between the left-wing guerrilla factions and the military regime reached its peak. While the Montoneros and other revolutionary groups saw their actions as part of a larger ideological battle to bring about social change and a Marxist revolution, the military junta viewed them as an existential threat to the national order. The military's aim was not only to fight the guerrilla movements, but to stamp out any challenge to the existing social, economic, and political system. The assassination of General Sanchez also underscored the weakening of Argentina's democratic institutions during this period. With the death of Perón in 1974 and the rise of his widow, Isabel Perón, to the presidency, the government was caught in a leadership crisis. Isabel Perón, who was politically inexperienced and struggling with her health, was unable to maintain control over the growing political unrest in the country. The inability of the government to handle the mounting crisis led to military intervention, culminating in the military coup of 1976 that overthrew Isabel Perón's presidency. This coup ushered in the military dictatorship, which would last until 1983 and be responsible for some of the most horrific human rights violations in modern history. From a broader perspective, the assassination of General Sanchez and its aftermath significantly shaped the political landscape of Argentina. The attack underscored the increasing militarization of the country's politics, where any form of political opposition, whether violent or peaceful, was met with overwhelming force. It also marked the final days of Peronism as a unified political force. Perón's death, his widow's ineffective leadership, and the military's growing role in governance further fractured the nation. By the time the military took full control in 1976, Argentina was already on the verge of a civil war between the government and the left-wing guerrilla movement. The military junta's rise to power in 1976 would soon trigger one of the most tragic periods in Argentina's history. Following the coup, the junta launched the Dirty War, which lasted from 1976 to 1983, during which the military systematically hunted down suspected subversives. An estimated 30,000 people were forcibly disappeared during this time, and tens of thousands more were tortured, murdered, or exiled. The impact of these repressive actions left a deep scar on Argentina's collective memory and shaped the country's post-dictatorship. Political culture. The assassination of General Sanchez in 1975 thus became a significant symbol of the deepening political violence that characterized Argentina during this period. It was a tragic event that exemplified the escalating tensions between the state and the revolutionary groups, each using violence in an attempt to impose their vision of the nation's future. Sanchez's death was not only a political act, but a harbinger of the massive state-led repression that would soon engulf the entire country. In the years that followed, the memory of Sanchez's assassination remained a critical moment in the broader narrative of Argentina's political violence. The Montoneros, who had hoped to weaken the military with such bold attacks, were ultimately crushed under the weight of the military's counterinsurgency operations. Their role in the conflict, however, would not be forgotten, and they would continue to be remembered as symbols of resistance against the military dictatorship that ruled the country for nearly a decade. The military junta's subsequent actions in the wake of Sanchez's assassination would lay the groundwork for the brutal and repressive nature of the Dirty War, a chapter of Argentine history that would leave lasting scars on the country's political culture. The deep political divisions that existed in 1975 only grew more entrenched as the military junta consolidated power and implemented policies aimed at eliminating all forms of political dissent. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. In 1976, Argentina was engulfed in a period of political turmoil known as the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia. During this time, the Argentine military junta launched a brutal crackdown against suspected left-wing activists, intellectuals, trade unionists, students, and anyone deemed a threat to the stability of the military government. This period, lasting from 1976 to 1983, was marked by widespread human rights abuses, including forced disappearances, torture, and murders. The case we are focusing on took place during this dark period in Argentina's history, specifically during the year 1976. The perpetrators of many of the crimes during this period were members of the Argentine military, including officers and soldiers in the Army, Air Force, and Navy. These military personnel were working under the direct orders of the ruling military junta. One of the key figures in this story is a man named General Jorge Rafael Videla, who became the de facto ruler of Argentina following the military coup of March 29, 1976. Videla was a key figure in overseeing the Dirty War and was directly responsible for many of the human rights violations carried out by the military dictatorship. Videla, who was appointed as the de facto president of Argentina, was instrumental in the establishment of secret detention centers where suspected political opponents were detained, tortured, and often killed. One such location was the notorious Yesemi, Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada, the Naval Mechanics School, which became one of the most infamous torture centers in the country. The victims of the Hondo were often taken to these centers where they were interrogated, tortured, and in many cases executed. Other military officers who played significant roles in the enforcement of the junta's policies included Admiral Emilio Masra, Brigadier General Orlando Augusti, and General Luciano Benjamin Menendez, among others. These men, along with Videla, made decisions that resulted in the abduction and murder of thousands of people. While they often claimed they were acting in the interest of national security, the human rights abuses that occurred under their command left a lasting scar on the country. In addition to the military personnel, there were also civilian collaborators who played a role in the crimes of this era. Many were part of pro-military organizations that supported the junta and helped in identifying individuals they believed were left-wing sympathizers. These individuals often worked with the military, providing intelligence and sometimes even directly participating in the abductions and tortures. Some of them held positions in the police force, while others were part of clandestine groups that operated alongside the military. As the military junta consolidated its power, it became clear that the regime's efforts to eliminate perceived threats to the state were indiscriminate. They often targeted anyone who was suspected of being involved in political activism or who opposed the authoritarian government. These included students, teachers, union workers, and intellectuals, but also ordinary citizens who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victims were often arrested without charge, held in secret locations, and subjected to brutal forms of torture. This context of widespread fear, secrecy, and repression laid the foundation for numerous criminal activities throughout Argentina during the Dirty War. The crimes committed during this time were not only violations of human rights, but also involved systematic and planned operations designed to silence opposition through terror. The military junta's tactics included surveillance, censorship, and the manipulation of the judicial system to suppress dissent and maintain control. One of the most notorious operations was Operation Condor, a covert program in which the Argentine military collaborated with other Latin American dictatorships to target and eliminate leftist movements across the continent. This operation involved the coordination of military intelligence and secret police forces from countries such as Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia. It led to cross-border kidnappings, murders, and the forced disappearance of thousands of individuals, further deepening the crisis of human rights abuses during this era. Although many of these crimes were carried out under the authority of the military, the broader Argentine society often turned a blind eye to the atrocities taking place. Fear, political divisions, and propaganda efforts by the junta made it difficult for the general population to resist or even acknowledge the scale of the abuses. Those who spoke out against the government risked becoming targets themselves, and many families lived in constant worry that their loved ones would be the next victims of the regime's brutal policies. The crimes of 1976, particularly those committed under the direction of General Videla and his fellow officers, would come to symbolize the darkest chapters in Argentina's history. Decades later, the pursuit of justice for these crimes would become a focal point for human rights activists and the families of those who had disappeared. We will take a deeper look at the specific events that unfolded in 1976, the victims who were affected by the regime's actions, and the long-term consequences of the military dictatorship's crimes. In 1976, the military dictatorship led by General Jorge Rafael Videla escalated its campaign of repression against anyone perceived as a threat to the regime. The junta implemented widespread and systematic measures to suppress opposition, and among the most harrowing actions were the forced disappearances that plagued Argentina during this time. It was in this climate of fear and brutality that numerous individuals, including political activists, intellectuals, trade unionists, and students, were abducted by the military. One of the most infamous tactics used by the military was the night raids, where armed soldiers would storm into the homes of suspected individuals in the dead of night, arresting them without warning or any form of legal procedure. These arrests were often brutal and terrifying, as families were left helpless, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. People who were arrested were taken to clandestine detention centers, where they were held in secret, their whereabouts unknown to their families. The victims of these abductions were often taken to places like the SMA or other military-run prisons, where they were tortured in ways that defy comprehension. Torture was not just a method of extracting information, but also a way to instill fear and assert control. Many detainees were subjected to extreme physical and psychological abuse. This included waterboarding, electric shock, beatings, and sexual violence. It was a tactic designed to break the spirit of the detainees, forcing them to confess to crimes they had not committed or to give up the names of others involved in anti-government activities. The sheer brutality of the torturers is still remembered by survivors, many of whom have shared their stories in the years since the dictatorship ended. In one well-documented case, Claudia Paz, a student and activist, was arrested by the military in Buenos Aires. She was taken to the SMA, where she spent months enduring severe torture. After her release, she shared her experiences, describing the horrific conditions in which she and other prisoners were held. The prisoners were often kept in small, filthy cells, without adequate food or water. They were also subjected to constant psychological torment, with guards regularly making threats of execution and violence. Claudia's case was far from unique. Thousands of others suffered similar fates during this time. Another chilling aspect of the military junta's actions was the creation of death flights. During these flights, the military would often detain individuals, place them on planes, and then drop them into the sea or rivers while they were still alive, ensuring their death. The purpose of this cruel method was to make the disappearances appear as if the victims had simply vanished or had never existed. Further obscuring the truth of the juntas, it was a chilling way to eliminate political opponents without leaving evidence of the killings. One of the most tragic consequences of these disappearances was the effect they had on families. Many families spent years searching for their loved ones, only to discover that they had been killed or had disappeared without a trace. Groups such as Las Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and Madres de Plaza de Mayo, mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, emerged to demand answers. These groups were formed by women who had lost their children and grandchildren to forced disappearances and were determined to bring attention to the atrocities being committed by the government. Their tireless efforts led to the eventual recognition of the crimes and the beginning of the process of justice in Argentina. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the regime's brutality, the military junta maintained control through its propaganda machine, attempting to portray itself as the protector of national security. They used the narrative of fighting subversives and terrorists to justify their actions, all while denying the existence of the many disappeared individuals. The junta's repression was not just aimed at individuals, but it also sought to stifle any form of public opposition. Media outlets were censored, and any voice that spoke against the government was silenced or persecuted. However, the crimes of the dictatorship did not go unnoticed for long. Reports from human rights organizations, exiled journalists, and even some military whistleblowers began to surface, revealing the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. The number of missing persons steadily grew, and eventually, the scale of the military junta's brutality became impossible to ignore. Even with these reports, many of the Argentine population remained silent, often out of fear for their own safety. The situation was exacerbated by the military's holdover society, and it seemed that resistance was futile. In many cases, when people dared to speak out against the junta, they too would become victims of the regime's violent tactics. The sense of fear and paranoia was all-encompassing. At the same time, Argentina's military government was continuing its operations against perceived enemies. The junta's control over the country allowed it to operate in secrecy, and it wasn't until the return of democratic rule that the full extent of the crimes began to emerge. Families began to search for their loved ones, and human rights organizations began to demand accountability for the atrocities of the junta. The military regime's dark history was exposed, and the country would slowly begin to face the painful reality of what had happened during these years. The abductions, torture, and disappearances of 1976 marked the beginning of a long and painful struggle for justice in Argentina. While the survivors and families of victims endured immense suffering, their fight for justice never ceased. The impact of these crimes reverberated across generations, shaping Argentina's collective memory and its commitment to confronting past injustices. The aftermath of the 1976 military coup and the crimes committed by the junta has left a lasting impact on Argentine society. As the military dictatorship crumbled in 1983, following the defeat in the Falklands War and growing public pressure, the country transitioned to democratic rule under Raúl Alfonsín. However, the wounds of the past remained, and the fight for justice would become one of Argentina's most important political and social battles in the years to come. The truth trials, Juicios por la Verdad, were initiated in the late 1980s to investigate the atrocities committed by the military regime. But these trials faced significant obstacles. One major challenge was the full-stop law, Ley de Punto Final, passed in 1986, which granted amnesty to military officers and government officials responsible for crimes during the dictatorship. In addition, the law of obedience to duty, Ley de Obediencia de Deber, in 1987 provided immunity to military personnel who claimed they were simply following orders. These laws effectively halted most of the prosecution of individuals involved in the regime's crimes. However, as time passed and the search for justice gained momentum, the families of the disappeared, along with human rights organizations, continued to demand accountability. The Madres de Plaza de Mayo and the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo played a key role in keeping the memory of the disappeared alive. Their continued protests and campaigns for justice became a symbol of resistance against the impunity that had long shielded the perpetrators of the junta's crimes. In the mid-2000s, the tide began to turn. President Nestor Kirchner, who took office in 2003, played a pivotal role in reversing the amnesty laws. In 2005, the Argentine Supreme Court ruled to annul the full stop law and the law of obedience to duty, paving the way for trials against military officials and others involved in the atrocities. The decision was a significant victory for human rights advocates, as it allowed for the prosecution of those responsible for the disappearances, torture, and murder of thousands of people. This shift in Argentina's legal and political landscape led to a series of important criminal trials and convictions in the following years. Many former military officers, including some of the most prominent figures involved in the Dirty War, were finally held accountable for their roles in the crimes. High-ranking officers like Jorge Rafael Videla, Emilio Massera, and Luis Maria Genaud faced charges of crimes against humanity. In 2010, Videla, who had been sentenced to life in prison for his role in the dictatorship's crimes, was convicted again for the systematic theft of babies from political prisoners. For the families of the victims, these trials were long-awaited moments of justice. While the legal process was slow and painful, they provided a sense of closure and recognition for the suffering endured by thousands of families across Argentina. The trials also sent a message that impunity would not be tolerated and that the truth of what had happened during the dictatorship would not be forgotten. In addition to the legal efforts, another crucial aspect of the quest for justice has been the work of the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. These women, who lost their children to the dictatorship, also dedicated themselves to finding and reuniting the children of the disappeared. Many pregnant women were taken by the military, and after giving birth in captivity, their babies were often stolen and given to military families to raise as their own. The Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo have tirelessly worked to identify these stolen children, and through DNA testing, many have been reunited with their biological families. As of today, hundreds of individuals have been identified and reunited with their true families, though there are still many cases left to resolve. Despite the progress made in bringing justice to some of the perpetrators, the scars left by the dictatorship remain deeply embedded in Argentine society. For many families, the disappearance of loved ones is still an open wound. The psychological trauma, the loss, and the uncertainty continue to haunt the generations affected by the Dirty War. The struggle to preserve the memory of the victims and educate younger generations about the events of 1976 and the years that followed remains a crucial endeavor for human rights groups and civil society. Moreover, the events of 1976 and the years that followed also raised fundamental questions about the nature of power, dictatorship, and the responsibility of citizens to stand up against human rights violations. Argentina's experience with its military dictatorship has shaped the nation's commitment to democracy and human rights in the decades since. The legacy of the victims and their families has contributed to the country's broader efforts to build a more just and transparent society. The case of Argentina in 1976 serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. It is a testament to the resilience of those who fought for truth, justice, and the memory of the victims, as well as a reminder of the importance of confronting past atrocities. The story of Argentina's dirty war is one of loss, pain, and suffering, but it is also one of resistance, survival, and the relentless search for justice. In 2025, Argentina continues to confront its painful past. The Never Again, Nunca Más movement, which emerged after the dictatorship ended, continues to push for justice and truth. Each year, families of the disappeared gather on March 24th, the anniversary of the military coup, to demand justice and honor the memory of the victims. These commemorations serve as a solemn reminder of the atrocities that took place, but also as a celebration of the resilience of the Argentine people and their determination to never forget. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In 1977, Argentina was still under the control of a military dictatorship that had taken power in 1976. The country was ruled by a military junta, which led the government under the leadership of General Jorge Rafael Videla. The junta, which had seized control of the government through a coup, implemented severe measures to eliminate what it considered to be threats to national security. The regime used violence and terror as tools to maintain power, particularly targeting those with left-wing views, intellectuals, trade unionists, students, and anyone who opposed the government. At the heart of this government was a group of powerful military figures. General Videla, who was the de facto president, was the face of the dictatorship and played a critical role in the brutal repression that took place throughout Argentina during this time. Videla and his colleagues, including Admiral Emilio Massera and Brigadier General Orlando Agasti, were responsible for orchestrating the so-called Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia, which involved systematic violence against perceived enemies of the regime. The military junta justified these actions by claiming they were necessary to combat terrorism and subversion, but in reality, these actions targeted civilians indiscriminately, resulting in the disappearance, torture, and death of thousands of innocent people. The military dictatorship operated under a culture of secrecy, and its actions were often carried out in hidden locations, away from public scrutiny. One of the most notorious places where these crimes occurred was Yesemi, the Naval Mechanics School in Buenos Aires. Yesemi became a center for torture, detention, and death, with the military using it to imprison political prisoners, many of whom were brutally tortured. The junta also established other secret detention centers across the country to conduct their operations in secrecy. Many of those who were arrested by the military were taken without warning, often in the middle of the night. These abductions, known as forced disappearances, became one of the most tragic features of Argentina's Dirty War. Victims were detained without charges, held incommunicado, and tortured in secret locations. Many never returned home, and their families were left to search for answers. The perpetrators of these crimes were primarily military officers, as well as members of paramilitary groups that operated alongside the military. These groups were part of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, a clandestine organization that supported the junta's anti-communist policies. They collaborated with the military in hunting down people who were accused of opposing the government, helping to create an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout Argentina. Among those working for the military regime were also members of the police force. They often acted as informants for the military and helped to identify individuals suspected of being involved in subversive activities. Civilians who cooperated with the junta, either out of fear or ideological agreement, played a crucial role in providing intelligence on suspected targets, which helped fuel the violence and repression. The military junta's systematic approach to eliminating opposition was seen in the events of 1977, when the regime's brutality reached new levels. As the junta became more paranoid about its hold on power, it escalated its efforts to silence any potential dissidents, including targeting specific individuals, families, and even groups that were demanding justice for the disappeared. These groups were often made up of mothers and grandmothers whose children and grandchildren had disappeared without a trace. They began to organize protests and demonstrations, most notably around the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, in order to demand answers from the military government. One of the most shocking aspects of the military regime's actions in 1977 was its increased use of death flights. These flights were carried out in the dark of night, with victims often being transported on military planes, and once airborne, the detainees were thrown out of the planes alive, dropping into the ocean or rivers below. This method of execution was a way for the junta to dispose of bodies and further hide the evidence of their crimes. Many of the people who were disappeared were killed in this manner, making it even harder for their families to know what had happened to them. In addition to the widespread use of torture, the regime also launched Operation Condor during this period. This was a secret collaboration between Argentina and several other South American dictatorships, including those in Chile, Brazil, and Paraguay. The goal of Operation Condor was to track down and eliminate leftist groups and individuals who had sought refuge across borders. The operation led to cross-border kidnappings and murders, further intensifying the military's power over the region and ensuring that anyone considered an enemy of the junta could be eliminated without consequence. The junta's growing violence and repressive tactics left a lasting legacy on Argentina. Thousands of people who were targeted by the regime in 1977 and throughout the years of the dictatorship, were disappeared and never seen again. Families searched in vain for loved ones who had been taken, and the sense of fear and helplessness spread throughout the country. At the time, anyone who spoke out against the regime risked facing the same fate as those who had been targeted for their political beliefs. Despite the brutal repression, the military junta's actions were not completely hidden. While many Argentinians lived in fear, groups like the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, formed by mothers of the disappeared, began to publicly challenge the government. These women organized marches, held protests, and demanded justice for their children and loved ones. Although the regime attempted to crush these movements through violence and intimidation, the Madres persisted. Their voices, though often silenced through threats, helped to eventually expose the truth behind the junta's actions and played a critical role in the eventual push for justice. Despite the fact that the military dictatorship remained in power for several more years, 1977 became a key year in the fight for truth and justice for those who had been disappeared. The events that took place during this year contributed to the larger momentum of resistance that would grow in the years to come. The brutality of the junta, exemplified by its actions in 1977, was a pivotal moment in Argentina's history and would come to shape the nation's efforts to confront the past and seek justice for the victims. In 1977, the violence unleashed by Argentina's military dictatorship reached terrifying proportions. The junta, in its effort to suppress opposition, instilled a culture of fear and paranoia across the nation. Its violence was not only aimed at political dissidents, but also at anyone who could be perceived as a threat to the regime's authority. In the midst of this reign of terror, the victims were often innocent citizens, students, teachers, union workers, and intellectuals. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this time was the way in which young people were targeted. The military junta specifically targeted university students and young activists, believing that they were the core of the left-wing resistance. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this time was the way in which young people were targeted. The military junta specifically targeted university students and young activists, believing that they were the core of the left-wing resistance. These individuals were often arrested for simply participating in protests, distributing pamphlets, or speaking out against the government. The punishment for such acts was horrific. Many students were detained in secret prisons, where they were tortured in unimaginable ways, hoping to extract confessions or information about others in their communities. Take, for example, the story of Claudia Paz, a university student who was involved in political activism. In 1977, she was detained by the military, taken to the infamous Yesenia Detention Center, and subjected to extreme torture. For months, she was held incommunicado without knowing whether she would ever see her family again. Claudia's family, in a desperate search for answers, had no idea where she had been taken or if she was even alive. Like countless other families, they lived in the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing the fate of their loved one. Claudia survived her ordeal and was eventually released, but not without enduring immense physical and emotional scars. Many victims of the dictatorship's violence were not so fortunate. The victims' families faced the trauma of the forced disappearance, a phenomenon where individuals were abducted by the military and held in secret locations, with no explanation as to their whereabouts. In many cases, the victims were never seen again. Some bodies were discovered years later, but for many families, the uncertainty and grief never ended. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo emerged as a symbol of resistance during these dark times. The group was formed by women whose children had been abducted and disappeared by the military. These mothers began to gather in the Plaza de Mayo, the main square in Buenos Aires, to demand answers from the government. Every Thursday, the mothers would walk around the square, holding signs with the names of their missing children. Their protest, while simple, was a powerful symbol of the growing demand for justice and truth. The military junta, in its determination to crush any form of opposition, responded with brutal repression. The mothers were harassed, intimidated, and sometimes even arrested. Their resolve did not falter. The act of gathering in the plaza became a powerful statement against the regime, and their efforts would help lay the foundation for the eventual exposure of the junta's crimes. Over time, the mothers were joined by others who had lost loved ones, and the movement grew. The group's unwavering pursuit of justice put pressure on the government, and eventually, it would help expose the full scale of the military dictatorship's atrocities. In addition to the mothers and families, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo also played a vital role in the struggle for justice. The grandmothers were primarily focused on finding the children of the disappeared. During the Dirty War, many pregnant women were detained by the military, and after giving birth, their babies were often taken from them and adopted by military families. These children who had been separated from their birth parents grew up without any knowledge of their true identities. The grandmothers, whose own children had been victims of the junta's violence, dedicated themselves to finding these children and reuniting them with their biological families. The grandmother's work was crucial in raising awareness of the human rights violations committed during the dictatorship and ultimately contributed to the long process of recovering the identities of the stolen children. By 1977, as the military junta became increasingly paranoid and aggressive, the scale of the forced disappearances grew. Victims were often detained by death squads, groups of military personnel who operated outside the law. These squads would raid homes, take people from the streets, and arrest anyone suspected of being involved in any form of anti-government activity. People were tortured, sometimes killed, and then discarded, leaving no trace. The victims' families were often left with no explanation, no answers, and no closure. One particularly disturbing case was that of Carlos Aznars, a well-known activist and journalist. Carlos was an outspoken critic of the junta and frequently reported on the regime's abuses. In 1977, he was arrested by the military, and like many others, he disappeared without a trace. His family did everything in their power to locate him, but their search was fruitless. Carlos's case, along with countless others, highlights the widespread and systematic nature of the junta's actions during this period. While the government attempted to maintain the facade of stability and order, the reality was that Argentina was living through a nightmare of violence, fear, and human rights violations. Despite the regime's attempts to silence opposition, the efforts of groups like the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Grandmothers, and other human rights organizations began to gain traction. These groups, in their pursuit of justice for the disappeared, became an enduring symbol of resistance. Over time, their efforts helped expose the truth behind the dictatorship's brutal actions, and though many of the perpetrators had already fled or passed away, the survivors and their families continued their fight for justice. The year 1977 marked a significant point in the struggle for truth and justice in Argentina. The dictatorship's actions were becoming harder to hide, and the demand for accountability grew stronger. As the international community began to take notice of Argentina's human rights abuses, the military junta's grip on power started to weaken. Yet, for the families of the disappeared, the fight was far from over. The year 1977 marked a critical point in Argentina's painful journey through its military dictatorship. As the number of forced disappearances grew, so did the determination of the families and human rights groups to expose the truth. Despite the military's widespread violence, there was a growing movement of resistance that sought justice for the countless victims. By this time, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo had become the face of the fight for justice in Argentina. Their weekly marches, which began in 1977, were a powerful act of defiance in the face of oppression. The mothers walked around the Plaza de Mayo wearing white scarves, which became a symbol of their movement. With each march, they demanded to know what had happened to their missing children and called for accountability from the military government. At the same time, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo continued their relentless efforts to locate the children stolen from their parents. They began organizing to recover the identities of the babies taken from detainees, and their work would ultimately lead to the discovery of hundreds of children who had been raised by military families. The efforts of these groups were not without peril. As the dictatorship became more desperate to maintain control, the government attempted to crush these movements. Women were harassed, followed, and sometimes detained. But despite the threats, the determination of the families and the human rights activists only grew stronger. The junta attempted to shut down their voices, but their protests and actions shined a light on the truth of what was happening in Argentina. In 1977, as the junta's crimes continued, international pressure on Argentina increased. Human rights organizations around the world began to take notice of the atrocities committed by the military dictatorship. Reports about the systematic torture and murder of civilians were published in foreign newspapers and broadcasted on international news outlets. Countries like the United States and European nations were forced to acknowledge the human rights violations taking place in Argentina, though their responses were often limited due to geopolitical concerns during the Cold War. Despite the external pressure, the Argentine government continued to deny any wrongdoing. The junta maintained its narrative that they were fighting terrorism and subversion, and that their actions were necessary to protect national security. In 1977, the junta began to shift its focus to eliminating any form of opposition, not just the left-wing groups that had been their primary targets, but also any voices in society that dared to question the regime. This meant targeting journalists, intellectuals, and even moderate political figures who had no involvement in anti-government activities. The year 1977 also witnessed the disappearance of prominent figures in Argentina, including Rodrigo Gutierrez, a journalist who had been critical of the junta. Gutierrez's disappearance was emblematic of the widespread repression, as even those whose work was not directly political were silenced by the military. His case highlighted the deep levels of fear that had been instilled throughout the population, where speaking out could result in death or forced disappearance. His family, like so many others, was left to deal with the emotional and psychological toll of not knowing what had happened to him. During this time, Argentina's economy also suffered, further adding to the hardships faced by its citizens. The military junta used state resources to suppress opposition while maintaining the appearance of control and stability. They justified the economic hardships by blaming external factors, but the reality was that their policies were making life even harder for the average Argentine. The economic troubles combined with the brutal repression created an atmosphere of fear, hopelessness, and disillusionment. Despite the regime's power, cracks began to appear. The actions of the human rights groups, including the mothers and grandmothers, began to push the narrative of the junta's cruelty into the public eye. By the late 1970s, the international community was no longer able to ignore the scale of the human rights violations taking place. Within Argentina, the pressure for accountability began to grow, and while the junta still clung to power, their control was weakening. In 1983, after the defeat in the Falklands War, the junta finally collapsed, and democracy was restored in Argentina, with the election of Raúl Alfonsín. However, the transition to democracy did not automatically bring justice. For many years, the perpetrators of the dictatorship's crimes were not prosecuted, and those who had been disappeared remained lost. The full stop law and the law of obedience to duty, passed in the 1980s, offered amnesty to many of those responsible for the atrocities. These laws prevented the prosecution of military officers and government officials involved in the crime. It wasn't until the early 2000s, with the annulment of these laws, that the pursuit of justice gained momentum again. In the years that followed, the efforts of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and other human rights organizations continued. They fought to ensure that the crimes of the dictatorship would not be forgotten. Trials were held, and many of the military officers who had been responsible for the disappearances, torture, and killings were eventually convicted and sentenced to prison. The identification of victims continued, and many families were finally able to recover the remains of their loved ones. The work of the grandmothers was instrumental in recovering the stolen children and reuniting them with their biological families. By the time of the 40th anniversary of the dictatorship's rise to power in 2016, more than 13,000 people had been identified as victims of forced disappearance and murder. Argentina's journey toward justice for these crimes is ongoing, and the country continues to confront its dark past. The struggle for justice remains a critical issue in Argentina, and the legacy of the military dictatorship still shapes the country's political and social landscape. The events of 1977 were a defining moment in Argentina's history, and they marked the beginning of a long struggle for truth and justice. The families of the disappeared, the human rights groups, and the entire Argentine population have fought tirelessly to ensure that the atrocities committed during this dark period are not forgotten. Today, Argentina's commitment to truth, justice, and memory continues to serve as an example for the rest of the world, reminding us of the importance of confronting past crimes and holding those responsible accountable. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In 1978, Argentina was still under the control of a brutal military dictatorship, which had taken power in a coup in 1976. The regime, led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, ruled with an iron fist, using terror and violence to suppress any form of opposition. By 1978, the military junta had been in power for 2 years, and their methods of control had become even more ruthless. This period in Argentina's history is often referred to as the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia, where the government engaged in widespread human rights abuses. The key perpetrators in this period were the members of the military junta, including General Videla, Admiral Emilio Massera, and Brigadier General Orlando Agasti. These men were responsible for orchestrating and implementing policies that led to the abduction, torture, and disappearance of thousands of civilians. They justified their actions by claiming that they were eliminating subversives, those they believed were left-wing militants, activists, or anyone who opposed the military government. The military government used a vast network of police and military personnel to carry out these actions. They also worked with paramilitary groups, like the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, AAA, which was a secret death squad that operated with the military support. These groups helped to identify, arrest, and sometimes kill anyone suspected of being an enemy of the state. The military regime operated in secrecy, and many of its victims were detained in secret detention centers across the country. One of the most notorious detention centers was the Yesemi Naval Mechanics School, which became infamous for the brutal treatment of detainees. In 1978, the government's actions were more violent than ever. Not only were they targeting known political activists and members of left-wing organizations, but they were also targeting ordinary citizens who were perceived to be a threat to the regime. The military junta used extreme measures to intimidate the population. People were abducted in the middle of the night, often in front of their families. These individuals were then taken to secret detention centers, where they were subjected to torture in an effort to extract information or confessions. Many of these detainees never returned. Their families left without any knowledge of their fate. During this time, the Argentine government also sought to keep its human rights violations hidden from the world. The military junta went to great lengths to prevent international organizations and journalists from uncovering the truth. They tried to present an image of stability and control, even though the reality was that the country was in a state of terror. The junta denied accusations of human rights abuses, claiming that the victims were criminals and terrorists. However, the increasing number of disappearances, along with reports from human rights organizations, showed that the regime was systematically silencing dissent and eliminating anyone who opposed its rule. In 1978, the situation reached a peak with the FIFA World Cup being held in Argentina. The military junta saw the World Cup as a way to showcase the country to the world, presenting a facade of stability and normalcy. However, this event also brought international attention to the human rights situation in Argentina. In the months leading up to the tournament, the government intensified its efforts to suppress dissent. Journalists, activists, and members of the opposition were targeted. As the world watched, the military junta worked hard to hide its crimes, trying to present a clean image while continuing its campaign of terror behind closed doors. While the government worked to hide its actions, human rights organizations, such as the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, continued to demand answers about the missing. These mothers were looking for their children, many of whom had been abducted by the military and disappeared without a trace. The junta's response to these demands was brutal. Mothers were threatened, detained, and sometimes tortured. However, despite the repression, the mothers remained defiant. Their public protests in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires became a symbol of resistance to the regime. These women, whose lives had been shattered by the loss of their children, were determined to find out the truth about what had happened to them. The military junta's actions in 1978 were not limited to forced disappearances and torture. The regime was also engaged in the systematic stealing of children from their parents. Many women who were detained by the military while pregnant were forced to give birth in captivity. Their babies were often taken from them and given to military families or families loyal to the junta. These stolen children were raised with no knowledge of their true identities. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, another human rights group, emerged during this time to try to locate these children and reunite them with their biological families. The grandmothers' search for their stolen grandchildren would become one of the most powerful symbols of resistance against the regime. In addition to the physical violence, the military junta sought to suppress any form of cultural or intellectual dissent. Writers, artists, and intellectuals who were seen as sympathetic to left-wing politics were also targeted. Some were arrested and tortured, while others fled the country in search of asylum. The regime believed that by controlling the narrative and silencing those who could speak out against them, they could maintain their hold on power. They also sought to prevent any mention of the atrocities they were committing from reaching the outside world. The military junta's grip on power was strong, but cracks were beginning to appear. While many civilians remained fearful, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, as well as other human rights organizations, refused to be silenced. Their efforts to expose the truth of what was happening in Argentina would later play a crucial role in the eventual collapse of the military dictatorship. While the world watched the spectacle of the FIFA World Cup, the Argentine military government continued its brutal campaign against its own citizens. Human rights organizations, particularly the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, kept up their fight for justice despite facing extreme repression. The actions of the military junta in 1978 would have lasting consequences, shaping Argentina's history for years to come. The year 1978 was a turning point in Argentina's history, particularly for the families of the disappeared and the human rights organizations that had emerged during the Dirty War. Despite the regime's best efforts to maintain the appearance of normalcy during the FIFA World Cup, the atrocities being committed behind the scenes were becoming impossible to ignore. The brutality of the military dictatorship and its widespread human rights violations left deep scars that would last for generations. In the years following 1978, the repression continued and the military junta's hold on power seemed unshakable. However, as more and more people began to speak out, both within Argentina and internationally, the cracks in the regime's facade grew larger. The human rights organizations that had been fighting for justice, such as the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, persisted in their efforts despite the ongoing dangers. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo's movement had started in 1977, and by 1978, their weekly protests had gained global attention. These women, many of whom had lost children to the junta's violence, refused to remain silent. Each Thursday, they walked around the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, demanding answers from the military government about the whereabouts of their children. The government's response was one of aggression. They were harassed, intimidated, and even arrested, but the mothers refused to back down. Their protests and their bravery became a beacon of hope for the families of the disappeared, and their actions laid the groundwork for a larger resistance movement that would eventually help bring the dictatorship to an end. At the same time, the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo became increasingly active in their quest to find the children who had been stolen from their detained and disappeared parents. In the 1970s, many pregnant women were held captive by the military, and after giving birth, their babies were taken from them. These babies were then adopted by military families or families loyal to the junta. The grandmothers, whose children had been among those abducted, began a systematic search for the stolen babies. They worked tirelessly, using every means available to locate the children and return them to their biological families. Their efforts were not only a fight for justice, but also a fight for truth. These children deserved to know who they truly were. By the 1980s, Argentina's military dictatorship was beginning to show signs of decline. The country's economy was in free fall, and the military junta's inability to deal with the growing unrest began to erode its power. The failure of the regime to justify its actions in the international community led to growing diplomatic pressure. Furthermore, internal divisions began to surface within the junta as public opinion, both domestically and abroad, started to turn against the government. The Falklands War in 1982, in which Argentina's military lost a humiliating defeat to the United Kingdom, further weakened the junta's grip on power. However, for the families of the disappeared, the fight for justice was far from over. After the dictatorship's fall in 1983, Argentina transitioned to democracy with the election of Raúl Alfonsín as president. While the end of military rule was a relief for many, the legacy of the dictatorship's crimes was far from resolved. In 1986, the new government passed the Full Stop Law, which granted amnesty to many of those responsible for the human rights abuses. This law was followed by the Law of Obedience to Duty in 1987, which protected lower-ranking military officials from prosecution. Despite the laws that shielded the perpetrators, the efforts of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Grandmothers, and other human rights groups continued. These groups pushed for the repeal of the amnesty laws and for the prosecution of those who were responsible for the disappearances and the violence. The persistence of these human rights groups, alongside the efforts of many survivors of the junta's abuses, eventually led to a re-evaluation of Argentina's history. In 2003, President Nestor Kirchner took office and began to dismantle the laws that had protected the perpetrators of the dictatorship's crimes. The Full Stop Law and the Law of Obedience to Duty were repealed, and a new era of legal accountability began. By the late 2000s, a series of high-profile trials were held to prosecute former military officers and officials who had been involved in the forced disappearances, torture, and killings. Many of the most notorious perpetrators, such as Admiral Masra and General Vidila, were convicted and sentenced to prison. The efforts of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo also bore fruit. Many of the stolen children were located and reunited with their biological families. By the early 2000s, more than 100 children had been identified and their true identities were revealed to the public. The Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, the AF, played a crucial role in identifying the remains of victims and helping bring closure to families who had suffered for decades without knowing the fate of their loved ones. The struggle for justice is ongoing. The pain caused by the dictatorship's actions remains deep in the hearts of many Argentinians. As of the 2020s, trials and investigations continue, with many of the disappeared still not accounted for. The work of the mothers, grandmothers, and human rights organizations continues to be an essential part of Argentina's recovery and healing process. The struggle to uncover the truth and bring the perpetrators to justice has become a symbol of resilience and the unyielding demand for accountability. The year 1978 marked a critical moment in Argentina's history as the government continued its repressive actions against its own citizens. However, it was also a time when resistance to the dictatorship began to grow stronger, and the foundations for the eventual return to democracy were laid. While the pain of the past remains, Argentina continues to move forward, with the hope that one day, every victim will be accounted for, and those responsible for the crimes will be brought to justice. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In 1979, Argentina was still living under the grip of a military dictatorship, which had taken control in 1976 after a violent coup. The regime was led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, who ruled as the head of a military junta that had suspended civil liberties and brutally suppressed opposition. By 1979, the Argentine government's methods of control had become increasingly severe, and the country was still deeply entrenched in the dirty war, La Guerra Sucia. This period was defined by widespread human rights violations, including forced disappearances, torture, and extrajudicial killing. The perpetrators of these crimes were mainly high-ranking members of the military junta. General Videla, Admiral Emilio Massera, and Brigadier General Orlando Agasti were among the key figures who played leading roles in the regime's violent tactics. These individuals, along with other members of the military, had organized a campaign against anyone they perceived as an enemy of the state, including left-wing activists, intellectuals, unionists, students, and even ordinary citizens suspected of dissenting against the government. The junta's justification for this was framed as a fight against subversion or terrorism. By 1979, the repression was not limited to just those with political connections or activism. The military regime targeted anyone who could potentially challenge its power. Individuals were kidnapped from their homes or off the streets, tortured for information, and often disappeared without a trace. Many of these people were held in secret detention centers where they were subjected to brutal physical and psychological torture. One notorious detention center was Yesemi Naval School of Mechanics, which became infamous for its cruel treatment of detainees. Thousands of people were detained and disappeared, and the authorities consistently denied knowledge of their whereabouts, despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement in the abduction. Among the groups targeted by the junta in 1979 were the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a group of women whose children had been taken by the military. This group formed in the wake of the junta's brutal crackdown on dissent, and their members began to march every Thursday in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, demanding answers about their missing loved ones. The military's response was harsh. These women were often subjected to threats, harassment, and even physical violence, yet they refused to back down. Their public protests, held despite the risks, became an enduring symbol of the struggle for truth and justice in Argentina. By 1979, it was clear that the Argentine government's brutal methods were not just limited to the disappearance of individuals, but also extended to manipulating the political narrative within the country. The junta worked tirelessly to maintain control of the media and to suppress any mention of the growing number of victims. The government claimed that they were carrying out necessary actions to defend Argentina from terrorism, and they sought to maintain the image of a stable and secure country. At the same time, they continued to engage in violence to eliminate any perceived threat. During this period, Argentina's economy was struggling. The military junta had implemented harsh neoliberal policies that had caused widespread poverty and inequality. As the country faced economic hardship, the junta's actions became even more desperate. The leadership was increasingly focused on silencing any form of opposition, whether it came from political movements, intellectual circles, or the growing resistance of the people. In 1979, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP, was established to investigate the growing number of disappearances. This commission was tasked with documenting the human rights violations carried out by the military dictatorship, but the investigation faced immense challenges. The military continued to deny the crimes, and many of those involved in the abuses had been protected by the government. The findings of CONADEP were instrumental in documenting the scale of the junta's actions, though justice would not come immediately. At the same time, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, AAA, a paramilitary group with ties to the military, carried out additional violence against perceived political enemies. The group was responsible for targeting individuals who had not necessarily been associated with armed opposition, but were seen as threats to the regime's ideological control. These paramilitary forces used terror tactics, including assassinations, kidnappings, and bombings, to intimidate the population and silence dissent. They often acted with impunity, shielded by the junta's support. In 1979, the junta also faced growing pressure from the international community. The increasing visibility of human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, as well as reports from foreign journalists, brought attention to the atrocities being carried out in Argentina. As stories of forced disappearances and torture emerged, foreign governments began to speak out against the military regime. Despite this, the junta continued its campaign of violence, refusing to acknowledge its crimes. It was clear that they had no intention of relinquishing power, and they remained determined to control Argentina through fear and repression. The international community's criticism did not deter the junta, but it did spark a more organized response from within Argentina. Human rights organizations and activist groups began to gain more traction. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and other groups continued to build awareness of the atrocities happening within the country, despite facing constant threats of violence. These groups' persistence in demanding accountability became a crucial part of the resistance to the dictatorship. The junta's increasingly harsh actions, coupled with the growing defiance from civil society, would ultimately lead to its downfall in the 1980s. By 1979, Argentina was deeply entrenched in a crisis. The military dictatorship had taken full control of the country and was using every method at its disposal to stay in power. Thousands of people had been disappeared, and the regime's abuses seemed to know no bounds. At the same time, the military junta was faced with growing resistance from within Argentina and increasing international scrutiny. The years to come would reveal the true scale of the violence carried out during this period, but in 1979, the country was still firmly under the control of those who had terrorized it. Despite the junta's efforts to control the narrative and maintain power, the relentless pursuit of justice by human rights organizations like the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo began to expose the truth behind the regime's atrocities. Despite the military junta's attempts to suppress dissent and control the narrative of Argentina's political situation, the resistance against their reign of terror continued to grow. By 1979, the international community had become more aware of the atrocities being committed by the junta, and this led to increased pressure for accountability. However, the military regime refused to acknowledge its crimes and continued to exert control through violence and intimidation. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, one of the most prominent and powerful symbols of resistance, remained a central force in the struggle for justice. Each Thursday, they gathered in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires to demand information about their disappeared children. While many of these women were harassed, arrested, and subjected to violent reprisals, they refused to stop their fight for justice. Their persistence helped to raise global awareness of the human rights violations happening in Argentina. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, these mothers and other human rights organizations began to gather evidence of the junta's widespread abuses. Many families still did not know the fates of their loved ones, and the challenge of documenting the disappearances was immense. However, as the military dictatorship faced mounting criticism and pressure, the resistance began to chip away at its hold on power. In 1981, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP, was established, and it began to investigate the forced disappearances. The commission interviewed survivors and gathered testimonies documenting the scale of the crimes committed by the regime. Although the military junta was still in power in 1981, the findings of CONADEP provided a crucial record of the abuses. These efforts would eventually play a significant role in holding the perpetrators accountable. Once the dictatorship came to an end, however, the period following 1979 did not bring immediate justice. Even after the end of military rule in 1983, when Argentina transitioned to democracy with the election of Raúl Alfonsín, many perpetrators of human rights violations were still not held accountable. In fact, Argentina passed laws such as the Full Stop Law, 1986, and the Law of Obedience to Duty, 1987, which provided amnesty to military personnel involved in the repression. These laws allowed many of the key perpetrators to avoid prosecution, and many families of the disappeared continued to search for justice without any legal recourse. However, the efforts of human rights organizations, particularly the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, continued. These groups, along with survivors of the dictatorship's violence, refused to let the crimes of the past go unpunished. In the 1990s, with increasing public demand for accountability and international pressure, Argentina began to reassess its handling of the human rights violations committed during the Dirty War. In 2003, President Nestor Kirchner took office and began to address the impunity that had shielded those responsible for the atrocities. Kirchner's government moved to repeal the Full Stop Law and the Law of Obedience to Duty, which had protected the perpetrators of forced disappearances and other crimes. This marked a turning point in Argentina's pursuit of justice. In the years that followed, a new wave of trials began, and many of those responsible for the disappearances, torture, and killings were finally brought to court. Admiral Masra, General Videla, and other high-ranking officials were convicted for their roles in the atrocities, and they were held accountable for their actions during the dictatorship. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo also had significant success in their search for justice. In the 2000s, many of the stolen children of the dictatorship were located and returned to their biological families. The Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, EAF, played a crucial role in identifying the remains of the disappeared, using DNA testing to match families with their lost loved ones. By 2020, more than 130 individuals who had been abducted as children had been reunited with their families. Despite the progress made in holding the perpetrators accountable, many families still suffer from the uncertainty of not knowing the fates of their loved ones. The human cost of the dictatorship's crimes is incalculable, and for many, the journey for justice is ongoing. The memories of the victims and the struggle for truth and accountability remain central to Argentina's ongoing recovery from the trauma of the Dirty War. The crimes committed by the junta in 1979 were part of a larger pattern of state-sponsored violence that affected tens of thousands of people. It was a time when fear, repression, and brutality ruled Argentina. However, the persistence of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Grandmothers, and countless other human rights organizations showed that even in the face of extreme violence and intimidation, people could fight for justice and the truth. Their work continues to inspire not only Argentina, but the world in the ongoing struggle for human rights. Today, the legacy of the dictatorship is remembered, and its crimes are still being investigated. Trials against those responsible for the atrocities continue, and Argentina remains committed to finding every missing person and bringing those responsible for the disappearances and killings to justice. While the dark years of military rule may be over, the efforts of those who lived through them and fought for justice continue to shape Argentina's commitment to truth, justice, and memory. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. In 1980, Argentina was still under the oppressive control of a military dictatorship that had seized power in 1976. The junta, led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, continued to engage in widespread human rights abuses during the period known as the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia. This brutal campaign, which involved the forced disappearance, torture, and execution of thousands of suspected political opponents, was aimed at eliminating anyone who might oppose the dictatorship's control. The perpetrators of these crimes were mostly high-ranking military and police officials. General Videla was the head of the junta, and his leadership set the tone for the violent and authoritarian actions of the regime. Alongside him were Admiral Emilio Massera and Brigadier General Orlando Agasti, who were part of the ruling military clique. These men, along with others in the military and intelligence sectors, authorized and oversaw the systematic repression against anyone perceived as a threat to the regime, including activists, students, journalists, intellectuals, and even ordinary citizens. The Argentine military justified its actions by claiming that it was defending the country against terrorism and subversion. This vague notion of subversion was used to target anyone with left-wing or progressive views, as well as anyone suspected of sympathizing with political opposition movements. As a result, thousands of individuals were taken from their homes, arrested without warrant, tortured, and then disappeared. The regime sought to eliminate opposition through fear, and these tactics of violence and intimidation were enforced across the country. One of the most infamous aspects of the dictatorship's campaign of repression was the use of clandestine detention centers, where victims were held in secret, often for months or even years, while being subjected to brutal physical and psychological torture. One of the most notorious of these centers was Yesemi, the Naval School of Mechanics in Buenos Aires, which became a hub for illegal detention and torture. Many individuals were detained at Yesemi and other centers, where they were tortured to extract information or simply to intimidate anyone who might oppose the junta. In 1980, the human rights organizations that had begun to form in response to the growing number of disappearances were continuing their efforts to document the atrocities and fight for justice. One of the most well-known of these organizations was the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a group of women whose children had been taken by the military. They began marching in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, demanding to know the whereabouts of their disappeared loved ones. Their protests, held every Thursday, became a symbol of defiance against the junta and drew international attention to the scale of the repression. Despite the junta's continued brutality, their actions were beginning to attract growing criticism both within Argentina and abroad. The international community, particularly human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, began to expose the regime's abuses. Foreign journalists and diplomats who had witnessed the violence reported on the forced disappearances and torture, and Argentina was increasingly condemned for its human rights violations. The Argentine government, however, continued to deny the scope of its actions. In 1980, the junta's efforts to suppress dissent reached a new level of intensity. The government made repeated claims that it was in control of the situation and that it was necessary to take harsh measures to protect the nation from communist influence. This justification allowed them to carry out widespread violence, including the killing of political opponents and the destruction of any groups that could challenge the regime's power. A crucial element in this effort to suppress opposition was the use of paramilitary groups like the AAA, Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. The AAA was a far-right death squad that operated alongside the military and was responsible for many of the disappearances and killings that occurred during the Dirty War. They targeted not only political activists, but also anyone they viewed as a threat to the junta's control, including trade unionists, students, and intellectuals. The AAA operated with impunity, and their acts of violence were often carried out in collaboration with the military and police forces. In 1980, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and other human rights organizations were gaining momentum in their efforts to expose the regime's atrocities. These organizations started gathering testimonies from survivors of the dictatorship's violence and working to document the disappearances. Many of the disappeared had been young activists or students, and their families were desperate for information about their loved ones. The human rights movement in Argentina began to slowly shift the narrative, showing that the government was not only responsible for widespread violence, but also for actively concealing its crimes. Despite the increasing resistance to the regime, the junta remained in control for the moment. Argentina's military leadership was determined to suppress all opposition and maintain their grip on power, even as the country's economic situation deteriorated. The junta's policies had caused severe economic instability, leading to widespread poverty and inflation. The regime's mismanagement of the economy further alienated the population and exacerbated the unrest. By 1980, the Argentine people were living in a state of fear, with little hope for political change. The military's brutality seemed unstoppable, and the forced disappearances continued unabated. However, there were still signs of hope. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and other human rights groups refused to remain silent, continuing to pressure both the government and the international community to the human rights violations that were happening in Argentina. By 1980, the military dictatorship in Argentina was under increasing pressure both from within the country and abroad. The military junta, headed by General Jorge Rafael Videla and supported by other high-ranking officers such as Admiral Emilio Masra and Brigadier General Orlando Agasti, continued its reign of terror. They sought to maintain control through violence, suppression, and fear, targeting anyone perceived as an enemy of the state. However, the tides were beginning to turn as both internal resistance and international condemnation started to grow. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo continued their tireless campaign, gathering every Thursday in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires to demand information about their missing children. These brave women, many of whom were widows, mothers, and grandmothers, had suffered tremendous losses but refused to stay silent. Their public protests, which became internationally recognized, symbolized the struggle for justice in Argentina. Their actions, though met with harassment and violence from the military, were crucial in mobilizing both national and international support against the dictatorship's crimes. As the junta's reign continued, international pressure intensified. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights began to document the atrocities being committed by the Argentine government. Reports of forced disappearances, torture, and killings began to spread around the world, exposing the brutality of the regime. At the same time, foreign governments condemned Argentina for its actions, although the junta remained defiant and continued to deny any wrongdoing. The economic crisis in Argentina, exacerbated by the regime's neoliberal policies, also fueled discontent among the population. High inflation, unemployment, and widespread poverty made life even more difficult for ordinary Argentines. This economic instability, coupled with the growing resistance to the regime, contributed to the erosion of the junta's power. Despite their attempts to maintain control through violence, it was becoming increasingly clear that the military government's grip on the country was weakening. In 1981, a significant turning point occurred when the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP, was established. The Commission's mission was to investigate the forced disappearances and document the human rights abuses committed by the military junta. Led by renowned writer Ernesto Sabato, CONADEP conducted interviews with survivors, gathered testimonies, and began the difficult task of documenting the crimes. The Commission's findings, which were published in the report Nunca Más, never again were damning. The report detailed the systematic violence carried out by the military, including the forced disappearance of over 30,000 people, the widespread use of torture, and the murder of political opponents. The Nunca Más report became a powerful tool in the fight for justice and truth, though the junta's leadership refused to acknowledge it. The eventual transition to democracy in Argentina, following the fall of the junta in 1983, did not immediately result in justice for the victims of the dirty war. In the early years of democracy, the new government, led by Raúl Alfonsín, attempted to pursue accountability for the junta's crimes. However, the Argentine public was deeply divided. Many military officials and their supporters still denied the extent of the atrocities, while others feared that pursuing justice could lead to instability or even another military coup. This reluctance to confront the past was reflected in the passing of the Full Stop Law, 1986, and the Law of Obedience to Duty, 1987, which provided amnesty to military personnel who had committed crimes during the dictatorship. These laws effectively shielded many perpetrators from prosecution. However, the fight for justice did not end with the amnesty laws. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and other human rights organizations continued their struggle. The pressure they exerted, both within Argentina and internationally, gradually led to changes in public opinion. By the mid-1990s, the political climate in Argentina began to shift, with increasing support for holding the perpetrators of the dictatorship accountable for their crimes. In 2003, President Nestor Kirchner took office and began to make significant strides toward justice. He repealed the Full Stop Law and the Law of Obedience to Duty, allowing for the prosecution of those responsible for the atrocities of the dirty war. This was a crucial moment in Argentina's efforts to address the crimes of the past. Kirchner's administration also opened the doors for more investigations into the forced disappearances, and many perpetrators were finally brought to trial. The process of reconciliation and justice for the victims of the dirty war continued into the 21st century. Thousands of cases were reopened, and many of those responsible for the crimes were convicted. General Vedela, Admiral Massera, and others in the junta were eventually brought to trial and convicted for their roles in the atrocities. The forensic anthropology team, EAF, also played a key role in identifying the remains of those who had disappeared, reuniting families with their lost loved ones. Additionally, through DNA testing, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo successfully located and returned many of the children who had been taken from their parents during the dictatorship. As of 2020, more than 130 children had been reunited with their biological families. Powerful testament to the perseverance of these groups and their commitment to justice. However, despite the progress made in seeking justice for the victims of the dictatorship, the pain and trauma caused by the military regime are still deeply felt by many in Argentina. The scars of the dirty war remain in the collective memory of the nation. Families of the disappeared still search for answers, and the struggle for justice continues. The case of the dirty war serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding governments accountable for their actions. Today, Argentina remains a leader in the fight for human rights in Latin America. The country's commitment to justice, truth, and memory has been instrumental in the global movement for accountability in cases of mass human rights abuses. The legacy of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and other human rights organizations is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the fight for truth and justice is a powerful force for change.